Thank you all for coming. I think we've got a full agenda here through lunch. And speaking of lunch, there are coffee and pastries outside right now if you want to step out and get some. And I hope you're all going to stay for lunch. And I hope you're going to stay for the entire morning because I think it's going to be an informative and useful one. We're going to be talking about commercial diplomacy, which I know many of you in the room are longtime practitioners of. Or enthusiasts about. And we're going to talk about why it matters, how the United States is doing on it these days, and what we can do to make it better. So we've got a slight change in the schedule. We're going to have two opening comments, one from the State Department and one from the Commerce Department, appropriately, and then two panels. And then Sean Donnelly and I will do a very brief wrap-up at the end before lunch. Commercial diplomacy, I think I don't need to tell any of you, is important. It's an essential element not only of American economic policy. When 95% of the world's consumers are outside our borders, if you want to grow, you need to trade. It's very simple. And it's also, I think, an element of American soft power. How we represent ourselves abroad, how we remind people of what America can do and what it stands for. It's part of what we do. I have to add, there's a personal element of this for me. My first boss at the Commerce Department was Ron Brown, who was a practitioner of commercial diplomacy, and Jill Schuker is here as well and remembers him. In fact, he died engaging in commercial diplomacy, along with a number of members of the private sector who'd gone with him, in this case to Croatia, and a lot of friends of ours that we lost. So this has significance to me. I think there's a lot we can do to up our game in commercial diplomacy, and today we're going to talk about how to do that. So to introduce our keynote, first I'm going to introduce our co-sponsor and co-convener of this event, the president of the American Academy for Diplomacy, Ron Newman, who is formerly Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and 3 times as ambassador to all the easy posts, Algeria, Bahrain, and Afghanistan. And before that served in Baghdad. So, this is not somebody who spent his time in, a non-controversial area, knows diplomacy very well. So I'm going to ask Ron to come up and introduce our speaker, and then I'll introduce our second speaker, and then we'll go immediately to the first panel. Ron?
That would ruin the show. Well, thank you very much, Bill. And let me start off by saying thanks not only to Bill, but to CSIS, our partner in this operation, and a special thanks to my program director, Maria Rassos, and Japet, who works for Bill. Without the two of them and some backstopping from others, including Katie and many others, this just wouldn't have come together. You have no idea, unless you've done one of these, how much goes on to get there. So, CSIS and the American Academy of Diplomacy have been involved in working on the subject of commercial diplomacy for quite some years. We first did our big study about 8 years ago, I think, led jointly by Sean Donnelly and former Director of Foreign Commercial Service, Chuck Ford. And that study, and there's been a lot of work over here at CSIS as well, was based on interviews with a large number of U.S. companies. It was not an sort of academic pursuit. And what we found in that was that there were places where the U.S. performed well in support of business, and there were many places where it did not. The performance was uneven, and there was a great deal that could be done better. Now, in the intervening years, there have been improvements. I'm sure we'll hear about more. It's an ongoing process. It's one which we very much welcome. But much remains to be done. We suggested some changes. The Championing American Business Through Diplomacy, CABDA Act, was an expression of the congressional restiveness with the support for American business. And the fascinating thing to remember about that act is that it was passed by overwhelming bipartisan majorities in both houses. That was now 3 years ago, and at that point I think it's fair to say that there was still a considerable feeling that more needed to be done. We'll get some congressional views later. We're very lucky to have representatives here from all sectors, because basically commercial diplomacy should be a matter where everyone can agree. It's not about, doesn't matter what you think about trade policy or trade agreements or taxes or sanctions. It's about selling and winning. And that, I think, is why there has been so much bipartisan agreement. We'll have the opportunity to hear multiple points of view today from, thankfully, to Undersecretary Fernandez, starting with State, but also with Commerce, with a congressional view, business, and diplomats. I hope that it will contribute to increasing a more effective commercial diplomacy, something we all want. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Undersecretary Fernandez, who was confirmed by the Senate. You know, we refer to him for short, Undersecretary of Economics, or E, but he's actually got this huge portfolio, economic growth, energy, and the environment. And he heads all the bureaus that do those things. But to fill up his spare time, he gets to be the United States alternate governor to the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Inter-American Bank. So, he doesn't lack for things to do. He served previously, as probably many of you in this audience know, as the Assistant Secretary for Economy, Energy, and Business. So he came to his job with an excellent background in both government and business, and I'm sure he's drawn on it. He was a partner at Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, where his practice focused on mergers, acquisitions, and finance in Europe. Again, lots of good background. And then he has involved in the work of quite a slug of associations: the American Bar Association, the Association of the Bar of the City of New York State Bar Association. What are you worried about? He also recently taught a course on international business transactions. Anyway, I think sufficient to say he comes to us with a great deal of experience, a lot of background. We're very happy to have you. Undersecretary Fernandez, please.
Good morning. Good to see a number of people here who could teach me a lot about economic diplomacy, and in fact have taught me a lot about economic diplomacy. So I'm a little bit embarrassed to be speaking to Ambassador Sakuda, to a number of you here, Tony Wayne and many others, Bill Kraft. So I think you'll let me know if I've learned my lesson. Well, thank you. It's great to be here. It's great to be here at CSIS and the American Academy of Diplomacy. Let me thank you as well for inviting me to talk about what I think is a crucial topic of what we do at the State Department, and that is looking to work on and improve on U.S. commercial diplomacy. I don't really want to use the term revitalizing. I would argue, and I realize that it's not my title, it's your title of the conference. Commercial diplomacy has been long a priority of ours, but I'll be the first one to agree that it's a constant work in progress that we have to improve. I've actually, oftentimes I will go to country X and I'll see plane loads of Turkish diplomats and Chinese diplomats and others, and they're all accompanied by business people. I'll never forget being in Algeria, of all places, and seeing 2 plane loads of Turkish diplomats, and right behind them were about 200, 300 business people, and they were there to do deals. It was not about philosophy, it was about getting transactions done. But I will tell you this is a priority, and And if you take anything away, it's that we are working hard at it and we're trying to get better. And this is part of why I wanted to be here today. I think that our efforts have historically enabled us to promote American economic interests and also to create mutually beneficial partnerships. The fact of the matter is that we're a global economic hub, and we continue to be well positioned to leverage the innovation and leadership of the U.S. in technology, and with our private sector, I think we can achieve success. But this is something we continue to work on every day. U.S. commercial diplomacy, including at our embassies, has to continue to adapt and respond to the significant challenges in promoting businesses abroad. These are challenges that include increased competition from other countries, information technologies, rapid evolution, shifting international investment climates, international tensions, and the need to reinforce the connections between commercial diplomacy and foreign policy. We recognize that to strengthen U.S. economic diplomacy, we have to prioritize it. We have to prioritize it within our foreign policy, and we have to provide our diplomats with the resources and the training that they need to be effective. If we do that, I think we'll be successful, and that's what we try to do. I often find that my counterparts aren't really interested in talking geopolitics. They're more interested in talking about how we get transactions across the table. We are working with businesses to identify their needs and provide them with the tools to compete effectively in foreign markets. And we are going to continue to work with our partners and allies on these matters and talk to our partners and allies about commercial transactions and what we can do together, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because it's in our national interest. I think we're actually making progress, and I've been in this job for about 1.5 years, and I see the improvement already. We've taken an aggressive set of actions to modernize commercial diplomacy and to place it at the heart of our foreign policy. Just to give you a couple of examples, we've established the Regional Technology Officer Program, which places foreign service offices wholly focused on critical and emerging technologies in global technology hubs around the world. These are specialized officers who build networks with innovation communities to include startups, venture capitalists, and they also work closely with officers in promoting U.S. innovation leadership. You're also, and Ron mentioned it, the Championing American Business Through Diplomacy Act, CAPTA, that was signed into law in 2019. It reaffirms the State Department's role in promoting U.S. commercial interests around the world and provides us with the tools that we need to compete in the global marketplace. And we are working together with USTR and with the Commerce Department to lay out our partnership and to improve our partnership. And you will see an economic diplomacy action group that we're creating to coordinate our whole of government approach to supporting U.S. economic and businesses' interests abroad. The bureau that I was here and that I was privileged to work with a number of you here in this room 12 years ago, EB, is part of a broader undersecretariat that I now lead, and it's been closely coordinating with the Secretary's offices on his modernization agenda to ensure that we have the tools, the resources, and the processes to help U.S. companies compete and win deals. And I think some of these efforts are already beginning to bear fruit. Last year, we had 15 commercial deals that we advanced in CBA, one of our offices, that were worth over $89 billion. And then we did this in close partnership with Commerce's Advocacy Center. On the defense side, we helped to generate 17 deals worth over $11 billion in U.S. export content. And these are successes that we believe have the potential to create hundreds of thousands of well-paying jobs in communities across America. Many of these programs are going to continue to evolve, and we We set up, for example, something called Direct Line when I was here a dozen years ago. It's a great name for what's really a very basic program, and that it started out as a conference call. You'd put ambassadors on the phone, and you'd put U.S. companies that had questions and wanted help. And it was quite successful, and we continue to do that. In one example, though, we are now using Direct Line to incorporate new types of communications, and we're increasingly focused on new sectors such as critical minerals, communications networks, a lot on renewable energy, on infrastructure development, and there's always interest in having Direct Line programs. Internally, we are working closely with our friends at Commerce to improve support for our embassy deals teams. These are teams that are comprised of state economic officers, former foreign commercial officers, and members of other agencies, and they work directly with our companies at our overseas embassies. And we are, at the same time, with these deals and with these transactions, once a month at least, we have sessions where we analyze what we did right, what we did wrong, and how we can improve. And this is something we continue to do, again, because this is a work in progress, and we need to hone our tactics in order to achieve successful advocacy. We're doing a lot of commercial diplomacy these days involving Ukraine. Commercial diplomacy is also an increasingly important component of our support for Ukraine as we help promote the country's economic resilience in the face of a brutal invasion. We are committed to helping Ukraine recover and build a prosperous and democratic future, and U.S. companies are key partners in this effort, and they've remained engaged, and they're playing an important role in keeping the Ukrainian economy afloat, enabling local businesses to continue operating. We're also looking towards the future of Ukraine, the recovery of Ukraine, speaking with U.S. companies about what reforms would be helpful to improve the investment climate in a post-war environment. And that's an important dialogue that we have with the Ukrainian officials. I had one yesterday with the central bank governor of Ukraine, and we talk about what is it that we can do once this brutal invasion fails. In fact, on Thursday, I'll be privileged to participate in a high-level gathering of our interagency partners, the U.S. private sector and the government of Ukraine, at a conference hosted by the Chamber of Commerce, on how and what conditions will be required to expand U.S. private sector engagement in Ukraine. One of the things that is clear in my conversations with Ukrainian officials is that after the war, Ukraine will unfortunately have to be a construction site, and there'll be a lot of rebuilding to be done, and that's a role. It's a business opportunity for our companies, but it's also a strategic imperative as we move forward. So, in short, I can confidently report to you that U.S. commercial diplomacy is alive and well at the State Department, and not only remains a priority today for me, but it's something that we continue to work on as we try to meet tomorrow's challenges. We can get better. We can get better, and we will. We're always trying to improve, and you can be sure that we will always work aggressively to ensure that American businesses, that our bureaus, that our economic officers at the State Department, and the nearly 200 missions abroad, and that's part of our competitive advantage at State, that we have the resources and the tools that we need to compete. With the right policies in place, we will ensure that the U.S. remains at the forefront of international business for years to come. Thank you, and have a great conference.
Thank you very much. That was a great way to start off. Now we're going to hear from the Commerce Department. For those of you that have the agenda in the room here, he's listed as a panelist on the second panel, but he's gotten an upgrade, which happens not only in airlines, but here at CSIS. Dale Tcharski is a Deputy Director General of the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service. You'd think I would know how to say it after all these years. He manages a network of more than 225 domestic and overseas trade offices and a staff of more than 1,450 trade professionals. What you may not know, actually, when I was surprised to learn, is that the Foreign Commercial Service has people all over the United States in a variety of state offices. I learned that working for Senator Rockefeller, and we had somebody in West Virginia who wanted to sell things to Ukraine, as it happened, and we ended up having a good relationship with our West Virginia's Foreign Commercial Service officer at the time. So they're oriented towards exports and selling, but they exist here in the United States to help American companies that are here, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, figure out how to do things abroad. Dale previously was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Europe. He's a career senior Foreign Service officer with the rank of Minister Counselor who has served all over the place, Berlin, New Delhi, Dublin, Tokyo, Warsaw, etc. So he's got a great depth of knowledge and experience. When he finishes remarks, if there's time, he's going to take a few questions. If you're in the room and have a question, there's a standing mic right over here. Please go over to the mic and stand, and we'll go in order. For those of you that are online, there is a QR code here, and you can put your question in there, and we'll see if we can figure out how to ask it. So, Dale, all yours.
Thank you, Bill. Good morning, everyone. It's a delight to be here, and it's a delight to have an upgrade this morning. It's always nice on a Tuesday morning. Let me thank, first of all, the American Academy for hosting this program on commercial diplomacy, and of course, our friends at CSIS as well. It's a delight to follow Undersecretary Fernandez, and on behalf of our Undersecretary Marisa Lago and our Assistant Secretary Arun Ventrakoman, I'm very delighted to be with you this morning. Just to give you a couple of thoughts as we start the day from the Commerce Department's perspective. As Bill alluded, we are a U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service. We have about 250 staff across the United States in 48 states, representing all 50. And an additional 250 commercial officers at 120 embassies and consulates around the world. In support of those officers and in support of our companies, we have another 650 locally engaged staff that work with us at those posts as well. And of course, we have a core component here in Washington, D.C. That focuses on regional trade policy and support of our offices overseas, as well as our leadership here in Washington, D.C. What I would tell you in terms of what we have accomplished over the last year, our U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service, which also has, by the way, a component for inward investment called Select USA. Many of you are familiar with that. And we also run the Interagency Advocacy Center for advocating for U.S. companies that are trying to compete for foreign government tenders. And I see, and as I'm looking out here, as I'm looking around, I see a lot of colleagues from posts and I've worked with, and of course ambassadors and distinguished guests. It's just great to see you all here this morning. We are approximately 51,000 U.S. companies last year received support from us, which was an all-time record for us. We usually average around 30 to 35,000. Technology has helped us reach out to more. I think the pandemic helped us find a new way to approach business as well. So we were delighted to grow our client base, and we refer to U.S. companies as our clients, much like a consulting firm might, because we're going to support them in whatever they're trying to accomplish, either in exporting overseas or if they are established overseas in helping them with market access issues and things along those lines. We also, I would say, in terms of numbers of dollar value, about $95 billion of U.S. exports and inward investment last year from those companies. Small to medium size is kind of our forte. 85 to 86% actually of our clients last year, of those 51,000, were small to medium-sized companies. So when you see $95 billion, it may not sound like a lot for a year's work, but a lot of them are very small companies that were getting some things done. A couple of big ones in there too, but advocacy plays a key role, particularly in the defense sector, for some of the big ticket items that I think both state and commerce will work on. We bring about $350 back to the economy for every dollar that's appropriated to us. We're always, always interested in additional appropriations, and we've been working on that over the last couple of years, and have snuck forward a little bit. And we're looking forward to see how that plays out in the months ahead for fiscal year 25 in particular. But and that allows us then to grow staff and put people in places where we aren't located. Right now, we're in about 95% of the global economy, the GDP, and we're also 97% of markets where U.S. companies are doing business. So there's a few places we need to go, and where we're not represented in some of those smaller markets, we have our colleagues at the State Department through a Partnership Post program that work with us in those markets, delivering Commerce Department services in particular to help U.S. companies. And we do matchmaking, we do background checks, we do lots of things for U.S. business. It's about 25 different things across our menu, if you will, of services that we can offer. What I just want to touch on before I conclude is something that Undersecretary Fernandez referred to, and that is the relationship between commerce and state, which I think over these last couple of years has increased significantly in the areas of commercial diplomacy and of economic diplomacy. And CABDA, and I know many of you were involved in pushing that legislation forward and helping craft it. I think it was really important from where I sit. To establishing a better relationship, not only calling the U.S. government out and saying you got to do more for U.S. business, but also bringing us together in a way that's going to let us, regardless of resources, let us kind of work with each other to expand on the value that we can bring. And CABDA has done that. And I would say that where our offices in the Foreign Commercial Service and the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service would be interlocuting with the our State Department colleagues in the Economic Bureau, in EB, on a weekly or monthly basis, once in a while when issues came up. We're not working on a daily basis. We actually contact each other and are working on issues on a daily basis, and that's been going on for the last 6 to 8 months, and that is because CABDA has helped move us forward and helped us reshape the way we're thinking that we can support U.S. business from a whole of government approach. The Undersecretary referred to the Economic Diplomacy Action Group, EDAG, for short. We like, as we all know, we all like our acronyms. But EDAG is really important. It's a subset of CABDA that allows us to determine how best to support companies through trade-related capacity building and technical assistance in particular. So if you look at economic diplomacy and commercial diplomacy, sometimes we kind of cross over and we're talking about one or the other. We're not always entirely sure, what aspect of it is. The reality is we want to help U.S. companies from the get-go, whether they're in the U.S. field and our field in the United States, to get them into markets where they can do business and where they can grow those markets and help the countries out and help their bottom line and creating jobs back home. And to do that, you've got to have economic and commercial diplomacy. And as we're looking at this under this EDAG, where we will have eventually an executive order that establishes this, I think, if we're in the weeks ahead, we're looking at an opportunity now to take trade-related capacity building on the front end and technical assistance on the front end to build those markets that aren't quite ready, perhaps, for U.S. business, where U.S. companies would look at them and say, it's a great opportunity, but, I've got other opportunities that can make me more money, over here or over there, right? It's all about competition. And so when you're looking at development in these markets, you have to have that technical assistance and support on the front end to create a playing field that's going to be competitive for U.S. companies where they can compete fairly. And this economic development piece, this economic diplomacy piece that goes into that is very, very important. And then commercial commercial diplomacy on the continuing spectrum of that is where we're looking at market access. Once the market is ready to go, you have access issues to get in, trade barriers, other kinds of things that get in the way, or perhaps, or maybe a lack of understanding of what opportunities are that would get in the way of companies actually establishing themselves. And beyond that is the promotion of U.S. business in those markets. So you take the capacity building aspects and the technical assistance aspects, you take the market access aspects and the promotion aspects of business, you bring them together under CABDA and under EDAG, and we have a great really sort of template for how the U.S. government is working on a daily basis now, as I said, to help U.S. companies, help get our heads around how we can help U.S. companies, and then getting that information out to our fields in our embassies and consulates around the world. The Undersecretary mentioned a couple things. Deal teams what we're looking at is a sort of a field-driven support of U.S. companies trying to get deals across the line, whether they be an investment side or export side, whatever the case might be, advocacy. We have been working hard with State on recrafting how best to help our teams around the world understand the resources that are available to them. Under CABDA, when you have USTR, Commerce and State sort of leading the Economic Diplomacy Action Group, you also have the DFC, Exim Bank, and others who are part of that discussion. And so the idea is to bring as much as we can from Washington to our colleagues around the world to give them the tools that they need in order to help companies on the ground in real time get deals across the line. And we're working on deal teams in a big way. We've been doing something almost quarterly now. It's actually more than quarterly. It's every other month, which has been something called an anatomy of a deal team. It's an internal review of successes that we've had with U.S. companies so that our colleagues can talk to each other. Everybody gets on from around the world. We look at a region. We look at a deal that was done. And we talk about how we did it and what we learned and how we can help the next company out in doing deals. So it's a great way for us to train ourselves, not only in things that we've done, but also in the collaborative nature of what we do together. And that collaboration really is something I think is special under CABDA. It's really forced in a way something that we've always had. We've had it a lot, as my colleagues who served overseas know. We have a lot of collaboration at our posts. It really works really well. What we need to do is ensure that collaboration is consistent. That's part of the reason for CABDA, and that we're getting that type of support, and that Washington can help out, right? And we can give the things that they need to do their business. And that collaboration, in and of itself, has brought us together. We are reinstituting something called the Benjamin Joy Award, which we haven't done in a couple of years, but we're emphasizing the collaborative aspects of commercial officers and econ officers and political officers and other people at the missions working together on behalf of business. It's not just about the deal at the end of the day. For us to be really good at this, we have to look at ourselves and say, how are we working together? What are the aspects? What are we doing to create that impact? And that's something that we're working on very closely with our colleagues there. Last thing I would say, training. We're working on training as well. Moving forward, Commerce and State, econ, commercial, working together, sharing best practices, finding new ways to be supportive, looking at the tools we have at our disposal. The Undersecretary, referenced something that I've seen as well. When we talk to companies or to governments around the world, they say, "Where are the U.S. companies? Where is the business?" We've got delegations from China, we've got delegations from Europe, we've got delegations from. We don't see the U.S. companies. We've got to change that. We've lost a lot of market share, including in our backyard here in the Western Hemisphere. We've got to change that, and I think we're going to be changing that through initiatives like this. So I want to applaud those who helped with getting that legislation across, because CABDA is really going to be really good for U.S. business in the long run. There's a lot of work to do still, but we've got some good momentum going. We've got a lot of bright minds working on it, and I'm really excited about that. And of course, we've got boots on the ground. When you combine the resources, the economic sections of the U.S. embassies with our commercial sections and that economic diplomacy and commercial diplomacy, it's going to be a good thing for U.S. business. So I'll stop there and say thank you very much, and have a great afternoon. I'm going to stick around and listen to the discussions. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, Dale. I'm going to try the first question. Sean Donnelly from
Hi,
the
Sean.
Academy of
Good to see you.
Diplomacy. Howard, nice to see you again. As you know, Chuck Ford, your former colleague, and I sort of got the Academy started on this process, and I appreciate your comments. Could you just talk a little bit about resources, budgets, numbers of FCS officers? I mean, you periodically see articles in the press that make it sound like there's
Including
some
yesterday,
questions.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So could you just talk about how, priorities are one thing. One of the ways you show priority is by how you allocate resources and how, what's happened, how are we today compared to how we were X number of years ago? Thanks.
Yeah, no, Sean, thanks so much, and it's good to see you again. It's always a tricky subject, in a public format. Let's talk about resources and things you need. But if you read the Politico article yesterday that referred to the commercial service, the foreign commercial service, and the number of staff that we have, and that we just don't have enough. Not only in commerce, I think in state as well. Both of our departments have gotten a little bit of money. State's gotten, I think, a good chunk for additional economic resources. We have gotten, we hope for more. We take what we can get, but we've done well this last year. I think we're going to do well going into 25 as well. We've got a plan, folks. I mean, there's no question. We have a 5-year plan within Global Markets, which is our parent group here, which includes our former market access group that was put together with the commercial service. We've got a plan for growth that will create additional, not only additional positions at our embassies and consulates where we do business, but also we're going to open some new offices as well. Last year, using some of the resources that we'd received, we were able to open Bangladesh, which is a hot market for us, formerly a partnership post for us. Many of you may have served there. Some of you may have been through. And we're excited about that because that's a big market for U.S. business. There are others down the line. I can tell you that without being able to tell you exactly where, that we are actively looking at some additional posts right now, opening some additional posts with the resources we were able to receive for 23. And in addition, focusing on increasing our staffing, our capacity in key markets, particularly in Asia. Many of you have heard of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. There are countries there that we need to be sure we're paying attention to. We also have the Partnership for Global Infrastructure, which is important for us to put people in places where we can take advantage and really scope out the opportunities for U.S. companies. So it's looking pretty good. It's looking pretty good. I'm looking forward to 25. I always have. As my colleagues will know, I'm an optimist. I always look at the higher number. We always, things get sliced down a little bit, but we're doing okay. Would love to see us grow. I mean, we do need more people. The more we have, the more the better. I think, econ, commercial, in spite of that, our ability to work together in a greater way, in a more strategic way, is going to pay off for us as well. Oops. Sure. Let me put my glasses on.
Is there an emphasis on promoting sustainable practice? It seems that this is one area where the U.S. can influence matters of sustainability and climate change.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I understand the context of the question. The two questions are, if they're related, sustainable practices in terms of in terms of taking initiatives forward on things like climate change, on tech, for the future. There is an emphasis through administration priorities in these areas, and the way to sustain them is at least from our perspective is through our strategic planning. That we do not only at Commerce but with State to ensure that we're focusing our companies on opportunities that fit into some of these spaces like climate, like tech, like healthcare, and things like that. I'm not sure I answered the gentleman's question, but.
Are there other questions?
Hey, Dale. Hey. Thanks very much for the update. Very encouraging. So there's been a lot of attention, of course, to strengthening our internal capacity to manufacture, to build, to do other things. And it seems there's been a bit less attention to encouraging our posts overseas to do the kind of very important work that you just talked about. Could you say a little bit, our ambassadors and the teams getting regular indications that this is an important thing and that they're going to be looked at for how well they're doing here? One of the things in CABDA is to be a yearly report from each mission on the kind of work that both commercial and econ section are doing together at the mission.
Right, that's a great question. Thank you. And I can. I mean, reporting, of course, is the For a commercial person, for a Commerce Department person, Craig, I see the ambassador out there. We're it's the bane of our existence. We just like doing things. We like to do, but reporting is important, and there is an effort, particularly in the deal team side, to ensure that our embassies and consulates, that the chief of mission, is the chairman of that deal team, if you will. So we're constantly working at ensuring, and I think EB has done a good job, and CBA have done a good job at this at the State Department, to encourage ambassadors to say, hey, look, you guys are in charge of this, and we'll all fall into line. And whether it's whether it's an econ commercial team supporting an ambassador's view on something, or whether it's one or the other leading it, it doesn't really matter. But you do need, I think the point that you made is you do need chief of mission focus. And I think there's a lot of former chiefs of mission in this room that understand business and understand the importance, and it's exactly why. What we want to do is get a consistent message out that says, hey, look, this is something that's very important. Economic security, of course, is part of our national security back home, and it's key for us to underscore the importance of U.S. business. In conversations I've had with other departments, including Defense, for example, they recognize also the importance of that. They look at the E in DIME and they say, what can we do to do more? So folks are recognizing the importance of getting together as a whole of government to really strategically compete, help our companies compete, and use our companies to help us spread the message of the importance of what the United States offers the world, today. So I think the economic diplomacy action group and the messaging that will come out in the weeks ahead on that will do more to craft the importance to our chiefs of mission of their work and of their support for business. For me, as a field practitioner myself, I always try to make sure that the ambassadors are not only seeing the big companies when they come in with issues, but also the small guys that are coming in and trying to do things, because those guys are often leading, groundbreaking opportunity for our other companies that are like them in these markets. So to do more in both spaces would be absolutely great, and I think you'll see more messaging that way.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.
We'll now move on to the first panel.
Almost color coordinated, not quite. Some of us got the memo, yeah. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Matthew Goodman. I'm Senior Vice President here at CSIS, and I direct our economics program and have a great interest in this subject of commercial diplomacy, which is a really important tool of U.S. Economic statecraft, which we focus on in our program. So I'm delighted to be here with a terrific panel that I'm going to introduce in a second to frame the problem. The next panel has to solve the problem. We just have to frame the problem. So we've got the easy part here. But we're going to talk for about a little over an hour. As a panel, we'll talk for about 45 minutes of that. And then we're going to invite questions from the audience. There are microphones here in the room. Or if you online push the button on your screen, you should be able to ask an online question. And I think I can just barely read the screen from here, so I'll be able to read out the questions to our panelists. There are two kinds of panels at CSIS. They're kind of analog panels, and they're now chat GPT panels, where you just put in a question and you get a perfectly honed 5-paragraph answer, and that's this panel. But there's nothing artificial about the intelligence up here. There's a lot of insight and experience here. I've worked with or for most of these people, and you'll see in a second that they're the best in the business. And so I'm just going to introduce them going down the line from here. Michelle O'Neill is currently Vice President for Global Government Affairs at Corning Incorporated. She's worked at other companies here in town, but most importantly, from this point of view today and my own personal interaction with her goes way back. She was at the Department of Commerce for a long career and ultimately was Deputy Undersecretary for International Trade at Commerce, and I think is a well-known figure here in a CSIS audience. So welcome, Michelle. Next to her is Craig Allen, also well-known, I think, to many of you. He is president of the U.S.-China Business Council. Prior to that, he had a long, distinguished career at the Commerce Department, and then at the end, as ambassador to Brunei Darussalam. So he's also been sort of, well, of course, in embassies, he's been in the state world, but he sort of bridges both worlds, and longtime Commerce Department official, and we worked together in Tokyo long ago. He likes to think of himself as a China person, but I still think of him as a Japan guy from way back in the day. So that's great. And then Kathy Novelli, again, well known, I think, to this group, senior advisor at Shearwater Global. She's also president of Listening for America, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to forging a new vision of U.S. international trade engagement. So that's very interesting, and be interested if you can introduce that into this conversation. And what you're trying to do there, because it sounds like it overlaps. But Kathy, as I think everyone knows, was Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment in the Obama administration. And again, welcome back, Kathy. And last but not least is Tony Wayne. Ambassador Anthony Wayne is Public Policy Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and co-chair of its Mexico Institute Advisory Board. He has a number of other think tank and academic affiliations. He also has a 40-year career in diplomacy at the State Department. He was ambassador to Argentina, ambassador to Mexico, and I worked with him when he was a longtime Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs, so delighted to have Tony with us as well. Okay, now I'm going to mix things up, and I'm going to just to make it interesting, I'm actually going to start with you, Kathy, although I'm largely going to ask the same question of everyone, which is to explain, because in the two opening keynotes, we heard a lot of different words used around this term, commercial diplomacy, and I'm still not 100% sure that our audience or even I know exactly what commercial diplomacy is, because we heard things about advocacy, about making deals, about market access. Can you help to define what it is and why it's important? Why are we up here talking about it?
Well, I think it is all those things. I mean, I think that, and if I could also say, I think it intersects so much with our foreign policy. And I think Tony is one of the folks who understands that and did understand that. I think there's a lot of junior Foreign Service officers maybe who don't understand that and think their job is to only talk about, these big policy things. But actually, I think commercial diplomacy is about what makes commerce go, both in our country and in another country. And that involves advocacy for our own companies, because that's who we represent. We represent our citizens, our constituents. But I think it also involves, as was just said, it also involves making a hospitable environment so our companies can actually flourish in other countries, including export. And so with all this emphasis on manufacturing here, you want to be able to export also what you're making here. And it's not just about investment to manufacture someplace else. And so if there's not a hospitable environment there, then it makes it really, really hard. So I think it's all those things. I think it's advocacy, I think it's policy, I think it's foreign policy, and it's economic policy.
Great. Tony, do you want to sort of give a state perspective as well on this question? What is it and why does it matter?
Well, to build on what Kathy has been talking about, I start with a simple analogy. When you play many sports, you have an offense and you have a defense. And you have to have both. And commercial diplomacy and economic diplomacy is really the offense. It is to create that space for your companies to score, to create jobs, to build wealth at home. And the defense is where the last two administrations have largely focused their effort. This is not a new challenge, however. We perceived early, and the American Academy of Diplomacy and Ron Newman referred to the study they did back in 2 studies in 2016, 2017, pointing out that most other countries in the world, including our friends, were out competing us in the offense. And I think that has become more serious with the rise of China around the world, very competitive offense in many countries around the world, and the United States over-focusing on the defensive part of trying to just protect the market and build up at home. You have to do both. And so the commercial diplomacy, economic diplomacy, is trying to urge U.S. agencies to work together at home and in the embassies overseas to create that space for the economic wins that help bring jobs back home. Now, they also create jobs in other countries at times, and they do good, the same way that, as you know, many large international companies invest in the United States and create economic wealth. But this is all part of that interaction between governments and the private sector that can really multiply the benefits going forward. So I think that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about a balanced overall economic policy and what can be gained by having good commercial diplomacy, good economic diplomacy.
Okay, well, it's a little simplistic, but we sort of got a state perspective over there, and let's get a more sort of commerce perspective on the same question. Craig, what is it? Why does it matter?
So I agree with everything that has just been said. But commercial diplomacy from a Department of Commerce perspective largely is a microeconomic enterprise. It's facilitating transactions and facilitating services for individual companies. So when we talk about commercial diplomacy from a Department of Commerce perspective, there is a specific company with a specific need in a specific market, and we support them to obtain the appropriate services that they need. Now, in many cases, and indeed I would argue in most cases, those transactional type of facilitation services would be given to small and medium-sized enterprises. And from a Department of Commerce perspective, indeed, it's very one gets brownie points if one helps a new-to-market export company. If there's a company that's manufacturing something but has never exported before, getting them into their first market is a big deal. If there's a company that's exporting to Canada or Mexico, getting them into their third market, be it in Europe or Asia, is a big deal. So Dale mentioned some 25 different services that the Department of Commerce has to facilitate individual companies, CEOs and export managers and marketing managers within those companies to actually make those deals. And I won't kind of catalog them here. But I would note that at the macroeconomic level, there's a lot of trade missions and helping American companies in big trade shows overseas. Finding an American company the best agent or distributor appropriate to their needs in Warsaw or Lima, Peru, wherever it may be, would be an important service that the Department of Commerce would provide. And I would note also, at least by my definition, commercial diplomacy would include encouraging foreign direct investment in the United States to the extent that it creates jobs in the United States. So the ultimate final kind of currency that we're talking about here is American jobs. How many jobs are created through exports or through inbound investment? And to the extent that we have facilitated job creation or job support, then we have been successful. To the extent that we are not facilitating job creation, then we're not engaged in appropriate commercial diplomacy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Craig, and there's a lot more that I want to follow up with you on. But Michelle, so you're the only person on stage currently working for a single company. But you also have this experience at the Commerce Department working on these issues. So again, how would you explain what commercial diplomacy is and why it matters?
It's a great question, and the benefit I have in going after all of these folks is everything that's been said is I completely agree with. I think what I haven't heard enough about, and let me slightly detour from the question that I'd rather answer, is how do we all agree on the importance, we agree on the programs, we agree. I love the offense and defense characterization. Craig, you and I have been on the front lines doing these programs during our days at the Commerce Department, worked closely with state. All of the mechanisms exist, the programs exist. What I sense in the room is a frustration for how do you elevate that? How do you make sure that it receives within the bureaucracy the prioritization that it needs and within the business community and other stakeholders? So what I haven't heard a lot about is, I'm clear on what Commerce does, I'm clear on what state does. Where are the other constituencies? I don't know that commercial diplomacy is a topic that's regularly discussed in the C-suite and corporate boards. I don't hear enough of it from Capitol Hill. What about the governors? What about those states that directly benefit? All of the mechanisms and tools exist, but how do we all work together to create that constituency so that when a new administration comes in, it's a priority, it's a given, it's something that's adequately resourced, and there's always going to be a need for more resources. How many times have we been, on the front lines of we need more money, we need more officers, we need more locally engaged staff? That question will persist. The question then is, how do we lift this up? How do we prioritize this topic among some of the other key stakeholders? It can't just be about the Commerce Department and the State Department working better together.
Right. In fact, good, because I was actually going to ask next sort of, what is working, what isn't working in this space, and so you've already started to answer that question, but Kathy, go ahead.
Well, you asked me to weave in
Yeah.
what I found when I was doing listening sessions, and one of the things I found actually that totally speaks to what Michelle's saying is that mayors are off doing their own commercial diplomacy, and they have, at least several, told me they didn't feel like they were getting very good support from, the State Department, folks in country, et cetera. So they just kind of took it upon themselves to go off and help their companies, win contracts abroad, and as Craig was talking about, bring people to their cities. And I was really surprised. And the other thing I found is that a lot of companies have no idea what services they can avail themselves of. And so I think, and that's true even of big companies, not just, maybe the big defense guys or the big construction folks, they know about it. But I think a lot of other people just don't know.
I love this focus on local and state. We had a series, which I'm still hoping to revive and do another season of, but we called Economy Disrupted, a sort of webcast, podcast, as it were. And we interviewed mayors and governors, and we talked about a dozen of them in our last season, the mayor of Oklahoma City, of Phoenix, the governor of New Hampshire, Arkansas, Washington State, Oregon. And I think without exception, they all talked about these issues and how they were out trying to promote, trade and going on delegations or to promote inbound investment in their city or state. And it's obviously a major priority for these folks at the sub-federal level. So that doesn't seem to be as much a part of the conversation, at least in the public conversation here in Washington, as it might be. Tony, did you want to add something?
One of the parts of this new legislation actually calls for the establishment of a public-private commission that would include not just businesses, but some other representatives like local governments, because it recognized that that's something we haven't done well as a government. As ambassador to Mexico, I used to get states coming all the time and cities coming all the time because Mexico is right next door, so they sort of understood that, and it wasn't as challenging as going to some of those faraway markets. So there's a great awareness out there, and we're just not organized well to do that in the U.S. government. So one of the things, I know this is sort of boring bureaucratic things, but as was mentioned, this new legislation is sort of pressing the U.S. government to work more like a team, and it's pressing the U.S. government to work more with the broader private sector. Each of the agencies have sort of the big companies, you know, and one group that comes and talks to them. But what you need is this outreach. Commerce has an outreach. They're largely focused on SMEs. And state just established a state and local government office because it recognized that they weren't doing this outreach. But that's part of what needs to be developed. And the goal is really to have a series of well-working mechanisms that can continue on. Because too often what you've seen is between administrations, you've sort of let the things that worked well fall by the wayside, and then the new administration learns again things. So by the last 2 years, they start doing the things that it would have been nice if they'd done from the start.
Craig, when you were doing this, did you connect with, at the local government level, with folks that were trying to promote international?
Yeah. So let's parse some of the numbers. Dale had mentioned that there are about 250 foreign commercial service officers in about 100 cities in the United States. So that's less than one officer per million people. So you look at a large urban area, Chicago, you'd have 3 or 4 officers. And I think that these are not well-resourced offices. They're not particularly well connected with the local governments. I do think that resources are an issue here, and if resources were expanded and those arrangements formalized, that could really help. Across my career, Japan, South Africa, China, we welcomed governors all the time, mayors all the time, and we would consider the companies that would come with the mayor and with the governor to be the same as a commercial service or organized group. We only wanted to get them planted in the market with an appropriate agent or distributor to begin a channel, to open a channel of exports to that particular market. But the resources are important. Dale was a little bit shy to talk about this. The resources are necessary if we are going to have an export promotion and a commercial diplomacy program that we really need. And bare minimum, in my view, would be on top of about a $400 million budget, would be expanding that by 25% would be a good start. Adding 100 new people domestically in the United States, 100 new foreign staff overseas to actually make the one-to-one connection to find your agent or distributor, and perhaps another 25 officers. That would be, in my view, a good start. We're quite a ways from that, but I think that that's necessary to just catch up with the competition. President Macron took 50 French businesses to China. They sold an awful lot of equipment. I struggle to see President Biden taking businesses with him on his foreign trips. I wish he did. If he's not, then Secretary of Commerce or Secretary of State. The governors should, and they should be applauded for doing so for the economic development of their prospective constituencies.
I do want to come back to this question of sort of what we're competing against, what we're up against. But before we get to that, Michelle, again, you're representing a company that's a household name. Literally, I have Corning products still in my house that I inherited from my parents that you don't make anymore. But you know, why does Corning? I mean, everybody knows Corning, right? So what's the benefit of having, you know, folks out in the field or here advocating for you? Why would you need that? Or why would, you don't have to talk about Corning, but why would companies of your sort of size and brand value need these kinds of services?
Well, and I suspect Kathy can speak to it too. There's some things that an individual company can't do on its own. And a lot of it, particularly for the larger companies, tends to be in some of those bigger policy questions. I recall Kathy sitting down with you and your when you were with Apple and the Secretary of Commerce and talking about the importances of intellectual property rights protection. I mean, we haven't talked about that today, but it's critical. So I think having that kind of advocacy is really key. And then there's sometimes just to the more tactical issues that Craig pointed out. You know, who are the key players in the market? Where is there demand for our products and services? You know, as a check, we can't be everywhere either. And in some countries where we don't have representation, it is terrific to be able to call on the services of the commercial service or the state econ team. Standards questions, you know, some of those things that are big, intractable issues that only government-to-government dialogue can advance and move forward on. But then they're also, it is great in certain markets to be able to go over to the embassy and host an event with our customers. Nothing, has more sort of cachet or profile than an event with the U.S. Embassy in certain markets. So all those kinds of things are important, and probably I'm arguing against interest. We don't charge the companies enough for those services, but that's another question for another time.
But I also think that that companies being in these other markets, particularly in the developing markets, can have an incredible impact on their own. So, you know, as a policy person from the government arguing for all these changes, sometimes companies can demonstrate why those changes actually will help enhance not just their own well-being in that country, but the local companies' well-being too. And I think that can be a catalyst for change as well. And, you know, it trains people who are to be managers, to, et cetera. So I think that it is truly, I saw a question pop up, why is that a win-win? It is absolutely a win-win. I think it's a win-win for us. And I think it's not just offense. I also think it's defense in the sense that other countries are like pushing really hard for their own companies to be there. And sometimes some of those other companies' practices may not be what we think are the greatest practices. So what's then what's being shown by U.S. companies, I think, is largely going to be what we think are good practices. And that may not be the case for others.
And I again want to come back to sort of others and what we're up against. But first, just Tony, as an ambassador again in the field a couple of times, can you endorse this point that actually the companies being there on the ground and delivering good products and services, but also capacity and rule of law and other things are supporting our broader foreign policy interests? I don't mean to ask a leading question, but do they do that? Do they do that?
Well, I served once in a country with the highest level of anti-Americanism in the Americas. And so one of the greatest tools for America was the corporate responsibility programs of U.S. companies in that society, with the care they took for their workers, with the care they showed for the communities where they were based. And we did all we could to highlight those because it countered the stereotypic views of sort of rapacious capitalists coming in here to harm our country. That wasn't the case at all. Many, many great corporate citizens in this country that I worked in. And it does make a big difference. And it helps, of course, companies differ, but the best companies really are living the values that we share as America and helping spread those. And just one other thing, I'll just give a little anecdote about what was said about state officers. In some places where the state officers are the only ones there, they work very closely with Commerce back in Washington, and they do both the tasks that econ and commerce officers do at other places. In those places where there is a good commerce partner there at the embassy, we do a lot of what was being talked about of helping to fix policy. And I'm just going to give one example of the first time I realized how important economics are and how important an embassy can be. I was sitting in Brussels at the meeting, going at the embassy to the European Union, the mission to the European Union, and we sat in a meeting with a U.S. tech company that is now not the largest, but was a very large one there. The guys were explaining to us how this one regulation by the European Commission would make $250 million difference. This was way back in the 1990s, so that was a lot of money. In sort of the annual opportunities, if they could get to talk to them and have a discussion of the real substance of the issue. And so we helped arrange them to have a conversation. They did fix the issue. And so I learned that this is something that norms, rules, regulations do make a big difference. And that was just consistently reinforced around the world, that if you could sometimes go in and explain why this was not the best standard, the best norm, the best regulation, you could open a lot of opportunities. And there were opportunities for American companies, but there were also opportunities for their own local companies at other times to grow more. So there's a lot you can do in all the different aspects of interacting with a host government.
Great. And I was going to say, I should have encouraged earlier, stories are good. We would like to hear stories from your experience in the field in particular. But and let me also remind the online audience that your questions are welcome, so please start submitting those, and we'll get to those in a few minutes. Craig, I mean, there's so much to talk about here, but a couple of people have referred to others who are making offerings like this, so let's explore that a little bit. You work on China now. There's no panel at CSIS that's complete without a discussion of China, but I know you're more focused on the sort of bilateral flows, but from your experience in the field, I mean, what is China? Does China do this stuff, and is it effective, and how do we sort of respond to that? And then we'll talk about France again.
Let me return to the previous discussion first. I'm sometimes befuddled at the criticism of American companies' behavior abroad. In China, American companies are considered to be 8 of the top 10 employers in the country. And American companies are exemplars of American values. We are absolutely not corrupt, good labor practices, good safety practices, very good CSR practices, gender equality, the whole thing, modeling behaviors that need to be modeled in a developing market. The Chinese are very good at commercial diplomacy. They have a lot of programs to bring their companies to trade shows abroad, facilitated by local government oftentimes. So their local governments, provincial governments, will have large pavilions at trade shows in Europe or the United States or around the world. They also are, the Chinese government is very active at bringing buyers to trade shows in China. And so this is a extremely dynamic part of their commercial diplomacy program. I would note, however, that it's really the entrepreneurial drive of particularly the private Chinese companies that's really leading to their export surge, and indeed they're using net export growth as one of the 2 major engines behind their economic growth model. And that has been very successful, following in the footsteps of Japan and Korea and Hong Kong and Taiwan before them. I think it's running out of steam, that economic growth model. And so it will be interesting to watch their commercial diplomacy in the future. at the recent event in Guangzhou, the Chinese premier announced that it was the year of investment, of foreign direct investment in China. So they're doubling down on inbound investment promotion, and we'll see how successful that is.
Great. Michelle, do you have sort of perspective on this question of who else is doing this, and not just China, and maybe not just France, although France often comes up, and has already come up today, as a place that does, at least tries to do very focused, commercial diplomacy, and whether it's successful or not is another question. But have you seen that, and where do you think the competition is? Who's out there doing this better than us?
I guess I'm feeling contrarian today, Matt.
Good.
I wonder, are we really doing it badly? I mean, I'm just I question the premise, right? So I hear that we need more of our high-level officials talking about this more. We need more resources. With all due respect on the resource side, this has been a perennial question. I used to, in my old job, have to go up every year and defend, whatever budget increase we were asking for, and it was like any negotiation. You start with one number and then you work sort of towards it, and then, there's a cut here or a plus up there. But Craig, do we really think that Commerce will get 100 more officers I mean, you can ask for it, no problem, but so I guess I'm trying to understand, is it really just that we need the president leading a trade mission, or we need the Secretary of Commerce leading a trade mission? I mean, we all know what effort and work goes into that. I'm just wondering, yes, more resources, more visibility, but I'm not sure, I'm trying to get my arms around what the problem is.
Okay, that's a good challenge. Tony, do you want to answer that?
Right. I think traditionally the United States has hung back and thought, in many cases, that the private sector can do it. The private sector can do all this. And I think that's not true in a number of cases. It's certainly not true for smaller companies, but even in a number of countries, you need an entree to get in a lot of times. And that's why the French and the British and others have been doing it. Now, are they all successful in doing it? No, they aren't all successful. Sometimes there'll still be U.S. companies that will come out on top, but it helps if you have sometimes a mission, but just a more organized system. I mean, I was 40 years in the government, and we were never well organized in supporting U.S. businesses overseas, except the biggest companies. Biggest companies got a lot of attention. I won't say which one, but there's one of them that we in the Economic and Business Bureau supported all the time, all around the world, and they did really well. But there's a whole field out there of others that can get that little extra entry, that extra help. When they run into a blockade, they could get an extra door unlocked to find a solution. And that's what I think we can do better if we organize ourselves better. And sure, there are always going to be need for resources. And I've been pushing for the last 5 or 6 years to have 200 more economic officers around the world to compete with China, because we saw in Africa and many other places, China was just widely expanding, and we just didn't have the staff there to do that. We won't get them all, but we have already gotten some, and that's a big advance to go forward. But we just need to get better at coordinating among ourselves, using the resources we have, working with the private sector at various different levels, working with different levels of of government, state, and local officials to get out there in this world. It's a big, giant world. There are a lot of opportunities and a lot of benefit if we do it better. That's the basic pitch.
Right. Well, yeah, no, I think that's right. I just would look back over time and say that the mechanisms have existed. And what you need to do is create and embed in the bureaucracy a commitment to it. I think somebody said earlier, we do one thing for the duration of an administration, then the new team comes in. Yeah, thank you. A new team comes in and we reorder our priorities. So the question then is, if we all agree and we think it's something that transcends politics and administrations, how do you build the bureaucratic structure around that so that, when Dale is briefing the assistant secretary or the secretary, it's at the top of the list. When companies come in to ask for support from the Commerce Department, they say things like commercial diplomacy, commercial advocacy. When the President's Export Council, which has just been reconstituted, that they say the words commercial diplomacy. You know, how do you build out that bureaucratic structure so that it is a given?
That's why the Congress passed this law that we're talking about, which
But
in fact
they
lays
passed-
out a number of the things that's going to remain law when the Biden administration changes.
Right. And I think all of these things are additive and they build on a foundation that exists. I just think we have to be careful to not either create a new interagency group or pass another law, you know, embed what exists.
I think you're right about that, and at least, you know, one of the things that I saw at State was that folks, especially more junior folks, didn't necessarily see why that mattered, right? And that's a problem State has to rectify in terms of how it rates people and things like that, to me. And I would also say, I think, when you were asking, Michelle, well, you know, does it matter? I think especially when there's head-to-head competition with other companies trying to do something, you know, it's not every small business or whatever, but especially in places where there's head-to-head competition. If the U.S. isn't in there at a very senior level advocating, then I think the country thinks that we don't care, really. And so all of that power that we could bring to bear to say this is an issue, it's a political issue, it's not just an economic issue, isn't there. And other countries are bringing that to bear. And if I could say one other thing that I think is a good advancement, you know, when I was at State, one of the big complaints we got for some of these larger deals was that other countries had way better financing packages than we did, and we were so disjointed in what we could do. And I think that has started to turn around some with, you know, reorganization now, so that OPEC was reorganized and things were drawn in. And I think we do have to look at that because, you know, it's hard to compete if the finances on the table are just not as good, even if you have a great company. So I think we have to look at this on multiple layers. You know, it's not just knocking on doors, it's also providing the right tools.
Yeah, I'm glad you introduced finance because I was going to ask about that, but so if others want to comment on that dimension, I'd be interested in that. And by the way, when you said OPIC, the old Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which is now merged into this new U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, known as DFC, right? And they've got a bigger checkbook and an ability to do more interesting things out there with more tools than they had.
At least in my view, this should be prioritized because there are many positive externalities at the local level, at the firm level, at the state level to exporting. When there are exports, there are additional jobs, there's a lot of creativity engaged with that, and the more you export, the more dynamic the locality is. So if we accept the premise that there are positive externalities to exporting, then I think that we should contemplate the proposition that supporting that has a net public good. And I would be comfortable in arguing that, and that there has been a market failure. A lot of small, medium-sized manufacturers around the country would find it very difficult to begin exporting without support, and those people will benefit their communities if they receive effective support to find an agent or a distributor or a warehouser or an importer in Canada or Mexico, or ideally in 5, 10, 15, or 30 or 70 countries around the world. And that, in my view, creates positive externalities that are the proper purview of government interest and taxpayer support.
Any other comments on the financial dimensions of this? Because I do think that's a critical piece that.
Just only
Yeah.
to second what Kathy said, I remember a number of cases in the first 15 years or so of this century where other competitors were just coming in with better packages for financing. And if you're a local government and looking at that, you're going to look at how much it's going to cost you. And that's why we started trying to innovate to come up with better financial packages. It did make a difference in a number of these bigger cases where we just lost because it was more expensive to buy American, even if the quality was better.
Well, I was going to get to that issue as well. I mean, is it just the financial package, or is it, the kind of the overall American package is kind of more expensive because it's better quality? It is, often comes with more due diligence, more work and environmental impact of particularly project-based offerings. And, how do we, and we're not going to sacrifice that stuff, so how do we compensate for that cost disadvantage?
I think the difference is the disparity like this, or is it more like that? And so if it's more like that, then, a country can say, okay, this is way better. Yeah, you get what you pay for. So, okay, we're going to pay more. But if it's like this, I think it's a lot harder. And you saw a lot of that on the telecom side, right? You saw a ton of that when, we were very concerned about Huawei. But the disparity of what you could buy a Huawei system for and the U.S. system was just gigantic, and countries were like, you know what, this works, I'm going to go ahead.
Right. Yeah, and okay, other thoughts on
No, I think that the fact of the matter is other countries have their hand, governments have their hand on the scale in favor of their companies, and if we're not going to have an offensive game, then we're going to lose a lot of deals that we should otherwise win, and that will have an impact on our longer-term competitiveness.
Right. Okay. If, and again, invite audience questions. I see some starting to come up, but welcome more from the audience. If we were going to have to prioritize because resources are always constrained, can I challenge people to say in public where you think those priorities ought to be? I mean, like regionally, is there a part of the world that's more important than another part of the world, or is particularly underserved? Is sectorally there an area we should be more focused than others? Craig, you're nodding.
Well, where's the growth? Follow the growth, and the growth is in Asia. Between India, China, and Southeast Asia, that'll present some 60% of global growth. That's where we need to put our assets. That's where we need to make our investments. That's where we need to be as competitive as possible. Now, this is very difficult because unfortunately, we are not members of the CPTPP and or the Regional Cooperation and Economic Partnership, RCEP, that is binding Asia together. And so that is kind of outside the bounds of this discussion. We're getting into more trade policy there, but it just underscores the fact that we need to support exporters into these markets who are integrating internally without the United States being part of behind the tariff walls. And that should worry all of us. And I hope would be a spur to more aggressive, not commercial diplomacy, but trade policy.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts on priorities?
I would just add some of the countries that we've got either existing partnerships or trade agreements with. And we talked a little bit about North America, and, USMCA. What more could be done within this region to build up U.S. exports, Mexico, Canada, commercial and economic ties? I think would be time well spent.
That's a good seg to you, Tony.
I agree fully. And we have another calculation now, which is the need to have diverse and resilient supply chains. Let's not forget all the emergencies we went through the last few years. And so it's not just where the growth is, it's what's going to be a sustainable system, network of supply and production. And I think we do need to look in the Americas there. And I do think we can build off the existing agreements that we have. And in that, I think the digital chapters are extremely important in what we do, which is something the Biden administration has flagged as very important. We have great advantages as the United States in the digital arena, in services, and we should be building on that strongly and trying to build a set of norms and agreements and arrangements that will help our companies and our innovators, but will help others come into that. And if you think about small and medium enterprises, what greater facility is there than easy to use digital services to help people connect around the region or around the world to build these new supply chains in both directions. And so I think that does need to continue to be a big focus and an area of discussion, because this is one area we haven't really talked about yet. But there are a number of issues that are international and domestic at exactly the same time. And digital policy is one of those. Privacy, which relates to that, and the AI and all of that. We have to treat these as both international and domestic at the same time. And we need to build as much as we can strong norms and standards and understandings domestically, but also with our trading partners as we go forward. So I think that has to be a large priority for both trade policy and for commercial policy.
Well, that's music to my ears. We're doing a lot of work at CSIS on those issues and agree that those are really critical to all of these efforts and other things as well that we all care about. Does anybody else want to comment on prioritization?
I would say, just to build on what Tony said, and looking at the question there, the World Bank did a study with state that showed that a 10% increase in access to the internet resulted in a 1% increase in GDP in a developing country. I mean, that is amazing, right? And so to me, part of the priority is policy. It is privacy, it's those things, but it's also telecom policy. And it's helping our telecom companies to operate outside our bounds and having really good access kinds of questions, auctions for spectrum, satellite, all those things that our companies are expert at doing and have opportunities to do. And I think we, in commercial diplomacy, haven't really kind of put a push on that. But to Tony's point, I think it's the policies he mentioned, but I think it's broader, and that we really need to think about prioritizing that sector, not just only a region.
Okay, that's helpful. Michelle, did you want to say anything about prioritization regionally or sectorally, anything else?
No, I would go back to just I keep not answering your questions, Matt, sorry. I've known him too long. No, I would just go back to the priority setting, right? So Dale's still here, so I'm just pick on the commercial service because it's what I know well. But there used to be an exercise that the service did every few years where you looked at all of those key factors. Which countries are growing, which have rule of law, hospitable business environments, ease of doing business. We used to talk about that a fair bit. And you looked at the resources that you were allocated, and then you drew a line. And you funded everything above the line, and you broke the bad news to everybody below the line. And oftentimes, and having a conversation with the State Department, maybe that's where the partnership posts come in. But it's just the recognition that resources are finite, and you can't do everything well. And I would say I had, by anecdote, I had I won't name the country or the administration, but we did this exercise when I was in the International Trade Administration. My job was to present it to OMB and get approval, then to the White House. And I got a call, and it was, how could you cut your post in this critical African country that's a critical partner for us? And I said, well, with all due respect, I have one locally engaged staff there. And there is no post, there is no commercial service presence when you have one locally engaged staff. If it's that much of a priority, tell me where I should move the resources. I'm happy to come over and show you the analysis, both qualitative and quantitative. And the answer came back, it's a priority of the president's, you can't close that office. So we kept it going, and those of you at the State Department know, in commercial service, how much it costs to keep one person at a post in country. So I think I leave you with that to just say that those are the tough questions that happen within the bureaucracy and behind the scenes that I think have to continue to happen, and the partnership that we talked about before is critical.
Okay, there's more I want to do up here, but I see there's a gentleman waiting patiently at the microphone, and he's modeling for the others in the room. If you would like to ask a question, please stand behind that gentleman, and then you can, I'll call on you after him. But please identify yourself and then ask a question. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm Ludovic Arnaud from the University of Oxford. I have a question on the role of the Department of Justice in shaping commercial diplomacy. You brought France a lot, and in France in 2013 there was the acquisition by General Electric of Alstom, and that was when Alstom, which is the big nuclear company, was investigated under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act by the US Department of Justice, and this created a lot of pressure on the board of Alstom to sell the company. So the question would be, first, are you collaborating with the Department of Justice to promote a level playing field, which would be a more defensive approach, I guess? And second, is there still more action on a more offensive strategy to promote the interests of US firms through the Justice Department? So I know it's not a really diplomatic question, but
no, we like undiplomatic questions, but there are a lot of diplomats up here, so they can handle it. But I mean, there's a specific question or two in there, but I'd also say more broadly, I was going to ask about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and whether that ties our hands or is something that we live with, and because it's important and it's the law. How does it constrain our presence, commercially? But Craig, did you want to take on?
So I would say to your question, the Department of Justice has primacy over mergers and acquisitions in the United States, and they coordinate oftentimes with other mergers and acquisition entities or regulators around the world, and they're incredibly independent within the U.S. system in their operations, and very consistent in employing their principles with their fellow regulators around the world. With regard to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, I would say what a blessing it is that we don't have to even entertain the thought of any corrupt practices, that we could just say simply that we're Americans, I'm sorry, we can't engage in corrupt practices. And that's the biggest blessing that American companies have. And those kind of sustainable business deals and joint ventures and operations that we have around the world are there not for corrupt reasons, but because they're economically viable. And having worked in a number of locations that are well known for corruption, I find it just a complete blessing to have that law underneath us. Tony, you have a little bit of experience here.
You do. Completely agree. Oh, good.
So,
okay.
just to add that in fact the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was put in place because the playing field was very unlevel, because many governments around the world, including our closest partners, completely allowed their companies to pay whatever they had to pay to get a contract. And so we worked very hard to build a consensus. We got an OECD agreement in the 1990s that everybody in the OECD signed up to, but not many, or many did not want to follow until they realized what their economic diplomats had committed them to. And then gradually, over a period of time, we have expanded the consensus of sort of rules of the road in dealing with corruption. It's very healthy for the recipient countries, for the selling countries, for your partner the country and companies going forward to have an understanding that where you can't use corruption unless you want to take the chance of being caught and paying a very big price, either reputationally or possibly criminally in the United States. And now a number of other governments in Europe and elsewhere have similar laws that they put in place. So this is very healthy. Now, the other implicit thing here is the CFIUS process and the investment process and now the export process, which is going on, which also is applying different kind of filters to commercial economic activities involving U.S. companies and international companies. And that's a much more complicated process.
That was another area that I wanted to explore, and we'll come back to if we have time. But unless anyone else wants to comment on that, and I know you're waiting patiently there, but so is the person online. There's been a question up there from Ann Moisen of the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies, who asks, when was referred to by the speakers. Please specify how MED countries, which I assume is not Mediterranean, but medium-sized countries and partners, can use this to their benefit since they need jobs too, and their stability is a U.S. national security issue. So I guess that means the premise of the question is that if we're just exporting stuff to these countries, that's not somehow win-win for them, and we need to do more to support them. If I understood the question, does anybody want to challenge that premise or offer what we could do? I don't agree with the premise personally, but I'm not a panelist.
Well, clearly, it's a two-way street, and right now we're importing a lot more than we are exporting. So many countries around the world are benefiting from the U.S. market, and we've tried to keep our market open with a set of basic general rules under the WTO, and then if we have specific trade agreements, we negotiate those agreements with either a group or individual countries. So I think the basic premise of our policy has consistently been this needs to be a two-way activity, and so jobs can be created in both countries.
Right.
I think there's an opportunity to, we talked about supply chain resilience and needing to diversify sources, et cetera, and companies are always looking, particularly exacerbated by the pandemic. So I think there's an opportunity for countries that you aren't always talking about to participate in that process, depending on where they have an advantage.
Great. Okay. Sir, go ahead. You've been waiting patiently.
Thank you. Aaron Michael Gill. I'm chairman of the Industry Trade Advisory Committee for Intellectual Property. In the context of rules of the road, unfortunately, we've seen a pretty bad deterioration of the IP environment globally, especially for innovative companies like Corning and many others. The question is to sort of promote this sort of economic diplomacy environment. A lot of the companies that we represent need access to capital, opportunity, and expertise. And having those three things in an environment where the rules of the road and the playing field is level couldn't be more important. I'd love to hear some perspective on where you think we're going in that direction, because from folks that focus on innovation and IP, that environment's getting, unfortunately, worse, and getting access to those critical three buckets of resources is getting harder because the risk of engaging overseas is increasing. Thank you.
Anybody want to take that on?
Let me start. I would note, in the case of China, IP has gone from our #1 concern to number 10, 11, 12. The environment is much improved. It's not perfect. A lot to be done still, but as other countries have more IP, their enforcement improves. And certainly we've seen that in the case of China in accordance to our statistical data, our surveys. Where innovative companies can get capital from, that's a broader question that I think probably Kathy or Michelle would be much better at than I.
Well, I mean, there's venture capital in lots of places. I mean, and in fact, there's a lot of venture capital that's seeking good investments right now. And so you just don't I mean, I'm not sure I know precisely what if there's a specific country you're talking about, or, yeah.
The context, if you think about sort of the TRIPS waiver at the WTO, if you think about the U.S. giving a precedent for the misappropriation of U.S. technology, if you think about the advancement of India's sort of, the generics industry to some extent, and the narrative around IP harming innovation, that's never taken hold more broadly than it is today. And the economics that go along with that are going outside of the country. But I apologize if it's a little too in the weeds for
I'd say it's not in the weeds, but it's really the effect of a global disaster. And so what you really need are strong IP chapters, strong intellectual property agreements in the various forum, and you got to work hard to build that agreement, because people have just suffered through massive deaths in their country, and they're thinking, if only we'd had these drugs, if only we'd had this faster. That may not be the answer, but you're just going to have to work it through. And so, for example, the IP chapter in USMCA is a very good chapter. And so we need to try, that's one of the good reasons we should be in some of these other agreements, getting other countries to commit to common understandings. And the only way we're going to make progress is if we start, again, investing in these common understandings, especially in areas where the United States is so strong, like intellectual property.
Thank you. Okay. There's another question online, and it's directed at Kathy, but I think anybody can take it on as well. Thank you, Kathy, for bringing up the work of local government and the work of promoting our companies and supporting our companies looking to do business abroad. Would you or the panel have suggestions on how else local governments here in the U.S. can work more effectively to promote our companies abroad? And this is from Manish Goyal at the San Francisco Office of Economic and Workforce Development. So go ahead.
I mean, others may have thoughts too. I mean, one thing I would say is there have been some mayors that have just been extraordinarily effective. Mayor of Houston, mayor of Greenville, South Carolina. I mean, there's a number of them around the country who have just been hugely effective. So one thing I would say is talk to them, because they've obviously, with not a lot of resources, done a whole lot. And there's all kinds of organizations of mayors and things too that you can join into that are looking at those kinds of things. So to me, it's partly learning from others, what they've done that's super
right. The mayors
helpful.
seem to, again, from that program we did, the mayors seem to talk a lot and share best practices, and there's a lot of really good experience there. I presume the Foreign Commercial Service or the Commerce Department has somebody in San Francisco probably as well. I'm guessing there's definitely somebody in LA, because we had a person I didn't know. We had people who speak fluent Mandarin who are in LA promoting U.S. business in China. It's incredible, but presumably there is in San Francisco as well.
Yeah, certainly, and those to me are the obvious ones, but I would also say that a number of foreign countries are setting up offices in major capitals. Yeah. So I would seek those out as potential partners as well, because they've identified your market, your region, your city as potentially a hub for activity or increased investment and exports. So I think that's one group that we haven't talked about, but it's kind of taking a page out of our book, the U.S. book, and we're seeing a number of foreign countries do that.
Great. Okay, ma'am, you've been waiting patiently. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Mary Tarnuvka, and I was a long-term State Department economic officer, served in a lot of countries, mostly in Asia, places like New Delhi, Taipei, Shanghai, Seoul, and most recently in Ho Chi Minh City. So I definitely agree with Craig's comments about look at where the growth is, look at where the development is, and where companies are looking to diversify supply chains. One suggestion I would make when you're looking at how do you get those resources, leverage with the private sector, private business associations. My last overseas post was at U.S. Consul General in Ho Chi Minh City. I moved to become the executive director of AmCham. And I will say that That kind of partnership, which we had with the U.S. mission and which I had had in a number of posts as an honorary AmCham liaison, I think is a really critical way that the U.S. government, Commerce, State, and the Agricultural Department can really leverage your reach. And I guess that's my other question is, where is agriculture in all of this? Because overseas, it is a key component of any economic cluster working group, and in many countries I've served, it's one of the top US exports. Is that part of your commercial diplomacy initiative? I was delighted to hear how state, commerce, and hopefully USTR and other agencies are working more closely. Is the Department of Agriculture part of that effort here? Because every governor who comes, that's top of their agenda.
Right, and a really good question, and we've gotten through a whole hour without actually mentioning, agriculture and the Foreign Agricultural Service and so forth. How do they play in this space?
The short answer is that the Foreign Agricultural Service is a very wealthy sister that we all adore because they have more resources and are very targeted at specific commodity groups and have a very strong domestic base to keep that going. And U.S. agricultural exports have benefited as a result. By far the world's largest exporter of agricultural goods, and China was the largest market last year, $44 billion of U.S. agricultural goods, and we envy their financial resources.
Go ahead, Tanya.
Definitely, I believe the congressional people who put this bill together envisioned USDA to being part of this economic diplomacy action committee that they would set up, because they do recognize that. But I want to note that, of course, some of the main blockages that our exporters face are often phytosanitary and sentiments against genetically modified products, which is the kind of regulatory conversations you have to have with other governments and the kind of agreements you need to negotiate with them to allow those kind of innovative products to continue to be sold and traded. Again, yes, USDA is a key partner, but they need to work with their partners in commerce and state to really keep sustaining this growth. Can I mention one area that we just sort of briefly touched on?
If you've got 10 seconds of anything we haven't talked about,
really
really
quick.
Time.
One thing that sort of passed by as we talked to is workforce development. And if we think of some of these specialized sectors, and if we want to strengthen certain sectors, even from a security perspective, but also from a prosperity perspective, you actually need to invest in your workforces at home, but also your partners have to invest in those workforces if they're going to have systems that are compatible to yours, especially when we move into technology, telecommunications, digital area. And this is a field in which the United States is not very developed and strong. We have individual cases of successes. Those tend to be local, with mayors and governors and local universities and businesses present locally working together. But we haven't figured out how to learn from those experiences, share them, and to make them international, even in our most integrated markets across North America. So I just wanted to flag that we have to train, we have to find ways to make sure people are getting trained and have the capacity to take advantage of these evolving markets around the world.
Okay, any final benedictions from any other panelists? Okay, I think we covered a lot of ground and maybe encroached on the next panel's mission as well, but on the other hand, we probably didn't cover everything, certainly not in detail, so you've got an opportunity in the next panel to explore some of these issues further. So if you could please join me in thanking our terrific panel for their contributions. Thank you all. And I believe, unless Bill tells me otherwise, we reconvene in 5 minutes or 2 minutes? 3, 5. Okay. Are you going to say something?
process, if you can take your seats, and if you're out there in the atrium, if you can come back in, that would be good. We'll give everybody no one's paying attention to me out there, but that's all right. We're going to get started. Let me, before I turn over the panel, let me just say we just got a note from Congressman Allred's office saying that unfortunately he has a personal emergency and is going to not be able to join us today, which I'm very sorry to hear. Hope everything works out all right for him. We've added Dale Tukarski to join the panel, so he's now been downgraded from the previous upgrade, but that helps fill out the panel. And I'm going to turn it over to Ambassador Daugherty to introduce everybody and the topic.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. And it's always hard to follow such a great panel, but I think we've got a lot to pick up on. It is unfortunate that Representative Allred didn't join us, because I would have been very curious to hear why they thought cabinet was so important, the U.S. Congress. But as previous speakers mentioned, it was a bipartisan support. There were 4 Republican co-sponsors and 3 Democratic co-sponsors, of which Representative Allred was one of them. But I have a great panel here, and I know we're going to solve the whole issue of commercial diplomacy and give you some words of wisdom to walk away with. But let me introduce my fellow panelists. And Dale, thank you for being a great infielder, a utility player. It's great to be joining us again. To my left is Ambassador Chuck Cobb. He is the CEO of an investment firm and has extensive international business experience as a former CEO or COO of several large international companies: Walt Disney Development, Arita Corporation, and Penn Central. He has also been on the boards of 9 publicly held companies. Ambassador Cobb was the Assistant Secretary and Undersecretary of Commerce and Ambassador to Iceland. He was also on the board of OPEC and an ex officio member of Exxon's board. In addition, his wife, Ambassador Sue Cobb, was also with us as the former U.S. Ambassador to Jamaica. Ambassador Cobb created and endowed an annual $10,000 State Department award given to the career U.S. ambassador doing the best job in commercial advocacy. We have with us Kathleen Ambrose, who is a lawyer who has worked as a senior leader in political campaigns in the U.S. government as an international trade counsel and deputy general counsel in the Department of Commerce, and as a senior White House aide. As a chief of staff to a member of the House of Representatives and head of global government affairs for 4 multinational companies. She recently retired this year from TE Connectivity, a Swiss-based global electronics company. We have Ambassador Bob Sakura, has had a 4 decades career in the State Department as an economic officer. In Washington, he was a Deputy Assistant Secretary, EB, and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the State Department's new Energy Bureau. His overseas assignments include lower-income developing countries such as Yemen, and was an economic minister in Berlin and Tokyo. He now works on energy-related issues in the private sector and is a professor of diplomatic practice at American University. Dale, we've already introduced you, so I don't think we need to do it again. And I'm Kathleen Daugherty. I was the U.S. Ambassador to Cyprus. I was an economic officer, and most of my 25 and my 30 years at the State Department, I was in economic positions. And I was a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Europe and did a lot of negotiations on the ill-fated TTIP. So with that, I thought it would take kind of Tony's challenge, the offense versus defense, or offense and defense approach to commercial diplomacy. We are kind of, there's also been phrased, we're in a battlefield for markets, we're in a battlefield for influence. I'm going to use it a little bit more positive sense and be proactive versus reactive. So I would like to ask each of the panelists, how do you envision this proactive approach to commercial diplomacy? How do we take what we're already doing, and we're doing well. We've all acknowledged some of the shortcomings. What's our next step? And so, Chuck, I'll turn it over to you first.
Well, I agree with Tony that we do a very good job on defense. And so I guess I disagreed with the one question that we weren't doing enough in intellectual property and other policy areas. So I think we're doing a pretty good job. But I also agree with Tony, we're doing not as good a job offensively. And I liked his analogy to sports, because I think America at this time hasn't put commercial diplomacy at the highest level of our national policy. So I'm disappointed that our last 2 presidents, both a Republican and a Democrat, have not put commercial diplomacy at the top of their agenda. have not led trade missions, as was pointed out. The presidents of all of our major competitors, those presidents have led trade missions and they send a signal to the whole country that this is important, in addition to sending an important signal to the rest of the bureaucracy. And I'm disappointed in the last two administrations, Republican and Democrat. There have not been the trade missions that there were before. And I agree with the comments of the last panel that governors and mayors have entered the void because there hasn't been the leadership by the last two administrations that I think previous administrations have given commercial diplomacy in an offensive sense. So I personally am delighted that Congress, by a 400-5 vote for H.R. 1704, which was the basis for the eventual Congress passing the champion of cabinet. And so Congress has spoken. This is a high priority, and an instructions, a mandate to the previous administration when the law was passed, and the present administration, who unfortunately have done several good things, as we heard yet from the Undersecretary and from Dale today. Yes, we've made some improvements, but there's so much more improvements to go, and I'm hopeful that our president and all of our cabinet give this a higher priority, the priority that it needs.
Kathleen, any views?
Thank you for the question. I think I'm a little bit of a contrarian here. I would say two things. One is, I'm going to quote Martin Indyk, who just wrote a new book, and he says, "Don't be so timid." I mean, we are just so timid as a country. We are timid to acknowledge the relationship and the necessary relationship between business and the government. And we are timid about going out in front and touting deals. And, Macron was not timid. I mean, he just wasn't. And we probably could use a little bit of that moxie. So I think that's a good admonition, and it's a little bit of pulling together the strands of all the things that were said in the previous panel and what the ambassador just said. But I think there's a converse part of it, which is the contrarian part of me, having been inside multilateral, multinational companies for a good, huge portion of my career after my government career. Companies don't have a clue how to do this. And let's be honest about that. Of the 4 companies I work for, I can go through and name on one hand, in each of those companies, the number of people who have some sophistication about commercial diplomacy, the ability of the US government to help in achieving markets, advancing markets, investing in markets, expanding their markets. And I don't feel that we as the business community, and I'm just recently retired from that business community, have the necessary high-level pressure and push so that President Biden or President Trump or President Obama would actually take it very seriously. Who do they think is their peer? They think it's the CEO of the company. The CEOs of the company, if they spend 3 minutes on this in a year, it's a lot of their time. They have lots of demands on their time. And we as a business community don't make it the priority to put the pressure and therefore get the results from the top of the US government. And so I think in the end of the day, Martin Indyk's admonition is really important, and it comes down to symbolism in some ways, the symbolism of the CEOs investing their time and then getting someone like Biden saying, well, wait a minute, I'm listening to what the country needs in terms of business success. So I think those are two halves that bring together some of the strands we heard in other parts of today's conversation.
I think this is a great point, Kathleen, and I'm going to follow up with that later. I know most of us who have been ambassadors have been sometimes surprised when companies have come into our door with their level of preparedness about the country or market. And so I had a working assumption when I was a more junior diplomat that corporations are more sophisticated in their approach, and they weren't. So I do think we make a lot of generalizations and assumptions, and I thank you for bringing that up. Bob?
Yeah, I think you come back on that one too. I think coming back to your question, Kathleen, I think the big thing is be entrepreneurial. When I was listening to the presentation earlier and was playing, okay, there, you do the calculation and you've got so much money and here's the red line and you're below it. Well, I don't think this is a news flash. When you're the economic commercial officer in Yemen, you're not really expecting to be above the line. Now, okay, Yemen may be in a more extreme case, but you could be in Iraq, you could be in Albania, you could be in Austria, and you might not necessarily be where you want to be on that line. And so one of the things which I found both while I was in the department and while I was an econ off overseas, but also even as an ambassador, is you've got to be entrepreneurial. You've got to be saying, okay, I'm not going to be in the magic line where everybody's going to be dropping into me like I was in Tokyo. But what do we have here? What are the opportunities for U.S. business and getting those out? The other thing is being engaged with the local government. They don't have to know you fell below the line. So get in there and push. But then maybe this comes back at that point, don't be timid. Don't be a jerk, but don't be timid. And sort of look for those opportunities that you can get in there. Pull your team together, both in Washington and overseas, between the two, frankly, and push.
Yeah, it's. I think a lot of the elements to the answer to your question, Kathy, have been sort of teed up in the room today, and for me, outreach is really important. It's not just a whole of government approach to supporting companies. It's really a whole of America approach. When you look around and you see the response that many of our where we used to be the primary trading partner in many countries around the world, where China has taken over that role over the last dozen years or so, you see a desire for us to be there, but we're not there. So we've got to show up. The old saying, half of it or 70% of it is showing up. We've got to show up, and I think some of the things that were pointed out this morning about getting the governors and the mayors more engaged in bringing companies and bringing trade missions to market. We also have to show up with U.S. government presence in support of them as well. And for our folks in San Francisco, call our office, please. We're happy to help the mayor and the Economic Development Organization. Just throwing that back in from the last panel. But yeah, it's all about showing up. It's really about a whole of America approach, and I'm actually quite enthusiastic about the direction that CABDA has been leading us, because it is drawing the attention of senior officials across agencies, including the financial side of our equation, which is very, very important as well. And we've got to do more to incorporate that and make sure it moves at the speed of business, so that our companies can compete. But showing up is key.
Just two comments. One on the mayor and governor issue. There is a new office in the State Department on subnational diplomacy, headed by Ambassador Nina Hajian, who was the deputy mayor of Los Angeles, and she was involved in trade issues in LA, and now it's in the State Department. And I think what you're starting to see is this evolution of a federal agency relationship with the state governments or city governments. And it's something that I think is very positive. It needs to be more developed as a brand new office, but I think this is an indication. And how do you work? I think federal agencies are so Washington focused, we don't realize that we have a whole network behind us that need to be utilized. And I do think some of the things you said. One of the other issues that I also would like to hear for your opinion is we talk about the whole of government, and we've talked about the Department of Agriculture, obviously Commerce and State, but there's other players. When we talk whole of government, and just my own personal experience, we haven't talked about the intelligence services. And I do remember in one of the posts in which I served in, the intelligence services were aware of some market activity by other companies, for non-U.S. companies. And it was a revelation that they don't really care about commerce and commercial activities, and nor maybe should they. But as we talk about a whole government approach, should we bring in and really think about the Treasury Department, the intelligence services, DOD, all other government agencies to have this kind of momentum that we really need to make it a priority. So I welcome anyone's comments on that about when you think of whole government. We think traditionally of state and commerce, but we need to broaden that much more.
Well, I'll take on the issue of XM, which is part of America's portfolio of strength, hopefully. And unfortunately, the tag of corporate welfare has been attached to XM and to the former OPEC and other parts of government that do financing, and which I think is totally unfair and unwise. Because if you do a return on investment analysis, you will find that XM not only makes money from the interest rates it charges, but the jobs it creates. It is not corporate welfare. It is one of the few parts of government that can demonstrate a good rate of return. And so I think that whole concept of return on investment that I know I know your agency certainly does that at Foreign Commercial Service. It continues to, how many jobs have we created per dollar? And I know I've seen those reports, and they're very impressive. And so one of the answers that I would also make in the earlier panel, the whole discussion was, do we need 100 additional commercial officers? Well, I am sure a return on investment analysis would show that yes, that would make money, and yes, that will make money for the American taxpayer. And so, you know, that concept seems to be very important, and because the public understands that, so government bureaucrats, while they're trying to justify their departments, need to do that more often.
I want to sort of build on something Chuck said, but I also want to come back to this broader question about basically whole of government country team approach. War story. When I was ambassador in Azerbaijan, there was an offer, I think, for a $240 million satellite. The U.S. had the technology, the U.S. had the package. We had even done the earlier satellite. But this was that period when XM was not authorized, and so there was no XM. So what happened? We did the deal. The deal got split between the U.S. and Canada. Now, again, I'm from upstate New York. I like Canada. It's a good place. But come on. We literally shot ourselves in the foot. So that is that much money, the export that was lost in the United States. Those were jobs lost in the United States. We weren't able to compete at all in the launch thing. That went to the French. So this is why these agencies are important, why we need to work on them together. But I think coming back to Kathleen's question, one of the, and this goes back also to that earlier discussion about how an embassy can really help level the playing field. Pulling in the information that you get from all the people at Post and working together with all the people at Post is really important. I mean, we never even think about, like, even the State Department, our consular service, and what it does for the business community. I mean, they're the ones who handle the visas. If you want to get somebody to come to the U.S., or you're trying to get people out, or business people who are caught in some sort of problem, who are arrested someplace, they're the ones who are working on this. But we need to be thinking about, and we need to be sort of getting this point across to the other agencies, that what DOD is doing is just as important as what the Department of Agriculture is doing, or what Justice is doing. And try to sort of pull this together. A lot of this falls, unfortunately, on the ambassador and sort of pulling that sense together in the field. I think it's easier in the field than it is here in Washington, but maybe that's also something that needs to be kind of worked through as we follow through on the implementation of CABDA.
Yeah, I mean, in one of the posts I served at, we had 22 U.S. government agencies at Post. It would have been great if everyone felt commercial diplomacy was part of their remit. And how do you interpret, and what were the challenges in market access that you were facing, or any of these issues? And I think part of it is set by the country team, and the country team is an interagency group at an embassy chaired by the chief of mission. But it does start at the chief of mission, instructing everyone at Post that this is a high priority. Speaking of chief of missions, one of the issues that is a chronic problem we have, and it seems to be getting worse, is that a lot of our countries do not have ambassadors right now. If I seem to remember that some of countries such as Italy, Colombia, Kuwait, maybe Saudi Arabia either have nominees or have no nominees yet for the posts. An ambassador is an essential person. We have very qualified and talented DCMs who are acting ambassadors, but I do think as a symbol and as an ability to influence decision-making, the absence of an ambassador is a real problem. And I'd like to have your thoughts about it as all members of the panel. How do we deal with that elephant in the room when your key person in the embassy is not there?
Can I make a broader comment? I think it's a problem when there isn't the ambassador. We all understand that. But I think it is back to an underlying problem I see, which is we want to advocate for business. We want to see the interagency process work more thoroughly. But there's an overlay that we have to remember, which is the new administration. Every time there's a new administration, even if it's a continuation, it's the second 4 years, of their foreign policy attitude. And that foreign policy attitude translates down, again, it's a symbol, but it translates down into something like not staffing a country that is not deemed so important. It's not, they staffed certain countries right away, but the other ones sort of get lost in the shuffle. And so I think that foreign policy overlay is something, again, that companies really grapple with. They don't understand it. There are very few business people who pick their heads up and look at the broader world or the geopolitical structure or moves or trends, because their job is to produce whatever product they're producing and sell it and report their numbers, every week and every month. So you're dealing with a population that doesn't understand that stratosphere of the foreign policy issues. And I think those foreign policy issues translate down. The very specific example I have at the moment is dealing with China, and I'm sorry Craig's not here. I'm out of the U.S.-China Business Council milieu at the moment since I retired, but basically, let's be honest, the U.S. government is not advocating for business in China at the moment. They're not advocating for U.S. businesses to invest in China, build plants, employ more people. They don't want you to do that. I mean, that's their foreign policy. And so you can go and see the best people at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, and they were the best in the world often, and their hands are tied. So the foreign policy overlay is something that is extremely important, and that gets down to how are the agencies, the intelligence agencies, and all of the other agencies feeding into that process so that there's a counterbalance between kind of an overarching theory and the everyday practicality of what the interagency process is telling you. We're losing out to competition. In this case, we invited the competition to help us lose out in Bob's example of Canada. But there's the byplay between the regular apparatus of the government and this overlay of a new administration and a new philosophy. And that makes it much more complicated for businesses to navigate, and they're not sophisticated enough to navigate it without some signal from the government to help them out.
Yeah, just on that, and then Bob, I want to turn to you because you've also been in very countries that have been sometimes in the crosshairs of U.S. administration's policies. I think about Russia and all the U.S. investment in Russia that for both economic and political pressures pulled out of Russia. And again, that they were buffeted rightfully, by what was happening, and they should not have been in Russia, but it is actually a problem now when you think about it. The geopolitics overlay with economic and commercial diplomacy. And I would like to hear a little bit more thoughts on that, Bob.
Well, having been Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy, Sanctions, and Commodities, as well as PDAS for Energy, there's a little bit of geopolitics that sort of falls into both those portfolios. I want to just say one thing quickly about the ambassador thing, and then maybe get into this, because I think this is an important part in being proactive in how we deal with this. One of the things that we sometimes think about, I think what you were talking about, companies tend to, the CEO wants to talk to the CEO, so I want to go talk to the ambassador. Well, there's no ambassador here. Oh, there's a deputy. Okay, whatever, cool. That's not necessarily seen well, I think, by our companies. It is certainly not seen well overseas. Part of the problem, reality maybe, is that countries have kind of gotten used to us. They know when there is a change of administrations, there is going to be an interregnum, particularly in posts where you have political ambassadors. I came in as an ambassador I replaced a political ambassador, but it was 11 months between Dick leaving post and my coming up at post. And that was to Azerbaijan. Okay, so then you're trying to pick someone for a high-profile post. Now, if you're India, and you're the Indian government, and we're talking about how important India is in general, how important India is in trade, how important India is as a rising economy that is influencing everything, and it's 2 years before you get an ambassador there. And there have been some great chargés there. We've known them. But they're the chargé. And what message do the Indians take away from this? Which is basically, are you really caring about us? How much? Italy and so forth. I mean, again, we're picking, these are big posts. I don't think it's necessarily hard to get someone to say, gee, I want to be ambassador in Rome. But but I think this is an important part of this. I think, again, when we get into this other sort of angle on the geostrategic parts of this, of where policies will change and the crosshairs where we're on today, off tomorrow for a good reason. I mean, that's a reality, and that's something I think, again, that's an aspect of our commercial diplomacy we do have to think about. Because in some cases, there are a lot of companies that are going to stay there, that you're going to want to have stay there. Russia's wars in Ukraine, that's sort of an off-the-charts kind of situation. I don't think people expected that type of thing to come down the line again. But again, we do get into this problem sometimes with specific technologies and so forth that can become very hard to get licenses for, to get the export permissions for.
Chuck, do I?
I agree with everything that's been said.
Yeah. One of the things I think what's been interesting that no one has used the word national security when we talk about commercial diplomacy. We've used economic security, we used economic prosperity, we talk about jobs, but I think maybe the urgency behind CABDA and the urgency by why we have this panel is because we are seeing it as part of our national security. The strength of our commercial diplomacy is hand in hand with our strength as a national security and as a global economic and political power. I wonder if we started using that word, and this is also a response to you, Kathleen, in terms of private sector not understanding what the stakes are at play, that maybe getting this kind of phrasing without being too adversarial and too combative in how we do it, but reframing this as a national security issue, our strength as an economy is really essential to our future. And how often have we always said, where are the Americans? We get that all the time, where are the Americans? And it's where the American ambassador is, but where is American companies, where is American presence? And we're losing that ground. And I think as a priority, changing the language a bit is going to be critical to this. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that statement. And we've agreed that we weren't going to get into trade policy today, but trade policy is also critical to our national security. And for us as a country to not have had a new a trade agreement for the last 10 years and be the only major country in the world not to have had new trade relationships with free trade agreements is consistent with your point. This is a national security issue.
Chuck, you anticipated the question that actually was just asked online, but maybe if I can get some other reactions. It says, how could the U.S. pursue a proactive commercial diplomacy while it stays out of free trade agreements and keeps weaponizing trade against even allies like the EU, South Korea, and Japan? Anyone want to tackle that? Yeah.
Can I make a comment? I think this comes back to the question of symbolism. You remember, if you've been through, as some of us in the audience have been through, all of these phases of China MFN, remember how much time we spent on achieving China MFN and getting the WTO passed and getting NAFTA passed. And there was a conversation that was symbolic, practical, and galvanizing for and a galvanizing against that went on in this country that doesn't exist anymore. There's this kind of staccato, we are being taken to the cleaners by, that's what we heard in the last administration. Don't hear it as much now, but there's still some of that. And so we are missing a dimension with the American public. So that's why you end up with no agreements, no negotiations over the last couple of years. We did achieve the US-Mexico, the new version of NAFTA, but I think that symbolism of a conversation out there would be enormously to the benefit of advancing something like the pressure on more commercial diplomacy. But I would question the use of the word national security. If you were to tell the CEO of any of the companies that I had previously worked for that this is really in the U.S. national security interest of the United States. And even though some of the companies did an enormous amount of classified work and provided materials to the U.S. government. So there's a whole arm of lots of these companies that do that in a confidential way. But if you were to tell the CEO that we're working on this because this is in the U.S. national security interest, they will automatically run and hide because it's too controversial. They don't want to be seen. Then you're going to go into, I don't know, pick a country in Europe and you're seen, oh, sorry. You're seen as a tool of the U.S. government. That's not so comfortable. What if you're going into South America, you're going into Asia, and you're a tool of the U.S. government? So you have to be extremely careful, and CEOs are nervous. They want to be seen as global. They want to be seen as neutral, and getting support from their home country, yes, but they want to be very careful about that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think the way we phrase it is that our economic security is national security, and I think some companies will recognize that creating jobs back at home is what this is really all about at the end of the day. And if we can help create prosperity for ourselves and for others, I think it makes a big difference. It's important that we do the outreach to bring companies to bear in a national security sense or an economic security sense. To markets because they do line themselves up well with our national security interests. In other words, I mentioned earlier that there are agencies talking to us about the E and dime and the importance of understanding that where U.S. companies are present, particularly in a big way, we probably have a pretty good relationship with that country, and so we want to build upon that. And I think we've lost some ground over the years in terms of the volume and presence of U.S. business, vis-a-vis others who are taking more advantage of these markets, in showing that that we still are not only should be a favored country to work with, but we have preferred ways of doing business. And I think there's a lot of work to do. But I think the essence of economic security as a part of national security is an important piece. It's certainly important for us to consider as a government and as a country. I think it's an undercurrent within CABDA in some respects. We're recognizing the need to align ourselves in certain ways so that it makes sense. I think there's a lot of work to do still. Yeah.
I'd like to build on that a bit because I agree that I think if you go into a C Street and you start talking about national security, there's going to be like okay. I mean, certain companies, yes, that's their bread and butter, but many others may be nervous about that. It may be a case of using these terms in different audiences or different milieus. Mm-hmm. I think within the U.S. government, and that includes dealing with Congress, commercial diplomacy should be seen as part of national security. Right now, one of the big issues out there is access to critical materials. All the disruptions that came out during the COVID period, and how many articles are you seeing now about lithium? Back to your high school physics class, ladies and gentlemen. All these stuff that's going on for renewables, for batteries, recycling, China. All of this, our policies towards Africa are all involving all sorts of minerals that we have kind of forgotten about. At the same time, we're talking about reopening mines and processing here in the country. So that's a good example, I think, of where commercial diplomacy is national security. Now, on the other hand, I think that there's this broader case, which is what you're talking about, which is what companies are doing, and they're doing it for their stockholders. They're doing this to make a profit. They're doing it for the bottom line. That's going to have a beneficial impact on our national security. But I think if you talk about it that way, you may start scaring people.
I think it's a really good point, Bob and Kathleen and everyone, about how you target the narrative. Well, we're all talking about narrative right now and the messaging and the momentum behind the narrative and the messaging. I think we haven't been thoughtful about how to present this case. And this is what we're trying to make. We're trying to make a case here. We're trying to make a case with Congress, and Congress is making the case, and then mayors are, why it's so important for U.S. business to thrive overseas. And what can we do as individuals, either as government officials, as private sector, as trade associations, to promote U.S. businesses overseas and to deal with some issues like market access, so IPR valuations, or even pure licensing agreements. You can go on and on about why it's important, but it almost has been internalized by everyone who's playing in this field. Well, it is a priority. It is an essential priority of what we're trying to do.
I agree with you, and I guess I disagree with my colleagues to the left. As a CEO, I talked about the importance of trade. I talked about the importance of international, and I talked about it as national security. And I did it proudly, and I did it patriotically, and I think my shareholders liked it.
Could I ask a question? Did you come from a background that gave you that sophistication first?
Well, as an international businessman, I guess I did. But I think I understood PR, public relations, and I understood what shareholders like and what security analysts like, and I think they're patriotic too, and I think they understand national security, and I think it's important, and I think you're being too soft.
Don't be timid.
Don't be timid is what your message was.
Tagline.
Well, we also talked about the resource issue, and obviously there's a limitation to the number of Commerce officials and State Department officials charged with this activity. But I wish we could think about it. If everyone in a mission was charged with this commercial diplomacy aspect, resources would not be as much of an issue. If the political officer or the consular officer and the deal teams that Undersecretary Jose Fernandez talked about, that's an approach to it. And I think what we're seeing is we need to inculcate a culture within all our missions overseas and internally in Washington that commercial diplomacy has to be seen as higher priority as our military security and other aspects of it. One of the things I'd be curious about, and you talked a little bit about critical minerals, Bob, is this fast-changing world of technology and critical minerals. And I know even a few years ago when someone mentioned Huawei, and going out into the field and having to talk about 5G and not really knowing what 5G was, and even not knowing what U.S. companies did in this field and what did in the field, how do you equip embassy officials to keep up with the times, to not just understand what IPR is? Most of us know what IPR is after many years of working, but how do you deal with this fast-changing world under your feet? And there was a good article on foreign policy written by a current State Department economic officer who did a comment to a private sector tech company, and he said, the U.S., Washington doesn't understand cryptocurrencies, doesn't understand these new issues of the day. So how do we catapult knowledge to understand what's going on in the real world? I don't, so I don't have any answers, but I don't know if anyone has any thoughts here about how to deal with this new world.
Well, I would say that you have to talk to business, you have to talk to companies, you have to talk about what their what their needs are, what their desires are. We're talking about the point about ambassadors. What many of my colleagues would suggest is that when companies come to us, they usually come to us in the 11th hour. Usually when they have a problem. And what we need to do is we need to go out, we need to pull those companies in early in the game to help them compete. And in part of doing that is to understand what their issues and needs are. Folks at embassies, other sections beyond econ and commercial are really busy. They're doing all kinds of things, and so we have to grab the attention where we can. I think that technology, given its state today in the environment, basically in the national discussion, is something that folks around the world at our embassies and consulates, from ambassadors all the way through the various sections, would be very much interested in learning more about and how it affects them and how they can affect support for U.S. companies in that space. But it takes time, it takes energy, it takes training, and the more we can interlocate with companies at all levels in the embassies, the better off we're going to be. But it is an energy issue in terms of personal energy, putting it in.
Could I expand a little bit on the role of the ambassador? You mentioned that my wife and I endowed this award that goes to the top career ambassador that does the best job of commercial advocacy. We have a search committee that includes Ambassador Sean Donnelly, Ambassador Ron Newman, Ambassador Tony Wayne, and myself. And usually either the chair is usually the undersecretary or the assistant secretary of EB. And we have one or two other CEOs and usually the head of XM, about a 6 or 7 person. And so in the last years, we have received interviews of over 100 people, about 5 a year. And let me give you the common traits that win the award. And the award is structured more on the offense, Tony Wayne's word, than defense, on purpose, because I think we have a bias. We feel a bias that policy issues are easy for most career ambassadors. Offensive, get out and help the businessman, open the doors, use your contacts. You know, each of us as leaders have only so many contacts with the prime minister and or the foreign minister or the president, depending on the governance. But the winners of this award use those contacts to help American business make the deal by using their contacts and going in and telling the prime minister, this is really important to our country and our relationship with your country that you do this. Each of the award winners have been an integral part of their ANCHAMs. They go to the American Chamber meetings, they lead the meetings, they speak at the meetings, they give pep talks to those leaders, and they are good salesmen for America. And so the good news is we have some great ambassadors out there. We have some great winners. And one of the things I'm the most pleased with, that 7 of our winners have then been either assistant secretaries, undersecretaries, or in the case of Burns, deputy secretary. And so the winners of this award are also being rewarded with the top jobs in the State Department. Tony Wayne's one of those winners, by the way. So yeah, we have great ambassadors, but they're salesmen. And that's, I want my president to be a salesman and my secretaries of state and commerce to be out more salesmen, and I'm disappointed on that.
So I don't know if we have any questions from the floor. Ron, are you going to ask us? This is.
I am going to take advantage of this. Dale, thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. And so I'm going to apologize in advance because it's a little bit putting you on the spot, and it's not really your function, but you're the one official representative we have. In preparing for this conference and talking about it with a whole variety of people, and talking about it with people today, there is an undercurrent of unhappiness which is not quite being vocalized because we're all polite and we have our diplomatic training, and I will try to remain polite. But the blunt fact is the top of the, I want to say this, and I'll give you a chance to respond, but I want to say it partly so you have heard it here and can carry it back as well, frankly. And that is, the top of this administration is not sufficiently helpful to the promotion of business. CABDA was passed over 3 years ago. It mandates that the president establish a particular commission. He has not done so. It mandates that the Secretary of State chair with the Secretary of Commerce a group to elevate the focus of commercial diplomacy. That has not come into being yet. And the last one, I asked one congressional office that was highly involved in writing that legislation, what the last thing was they had heard from State, not Commerce, was that State was thinking about how they would organize the commission that the law mandates and to whom they would delegate the Secretaries of State's authority. What this radiates, and so I'm delighted to hear that all you're saying about CABDA pointing in the right direction or pushing in the right direction. But I'm also hearing the feeling that it's a day late and a dollar short, and by the time the administration finally, if they ever get around to actually exercising the mandate of the law, the administration may depart, and then we'll get to start all over again. So I wanted partly to give you an opportunity to comment, but it's not entirely fair because these are questions that relate to how the president and the secretaries of two divisions take action. I wanted to put it on record, though, so you take it back, because what I'm vocalizing is not just me. This is very broadly out there in the business community that we talk to, in the ex-ambassadors, in a whole lot of people. And I don't want it to get lost in the proper need for politeness while we're here. So I want to give you a chance to respond, recognizing that in a sense the question goes to other audiences.
No, thank you, and it's certainly message taken, and I will carry that back. What I think I can respond in a way, because it is a little late. It's a day late. Might be a dollar short at the moment, but I really feel, having worked closely with the State Department, as I alluded to earlier, working with EB on CABDA and on the Economic Diplomacy Advisory Group and on the additional advisory groups for U.S. business that will be forming as well, that we're almost there. And so I think in the weeks ahead, you're going to see some of that purpose and action that you've been missing from this. I can't speak for the State Department specifically, but I can tell you that Secretary Raimondo is very supportive of U.S. business, is doing everything she can to not only instill in us the importance of administration priorities, particularly in Asia, and for things like diversity and other aspects, and technology, and it's an environment. We have, within our strategic plans, have a renewed sense of purpose and focus from her priorities in doing so. But I would say just bear with us a little bit longer, and I'll put commerce into the room on that one. We're going to have a very good message to send on the importance of CABDA and the work that we're going to be doing together, and it's coming out shortly. Yeah.
Kathleen, to support Ambassador Newman's comments, in addition, all of his comments were reinforced by a Congressional Budget Office report in June of 22, basically saying the same things Ambassador Newman said, that it's been a long time and it's disappointing that these actions haven't been put together. So you might remind some of your colleagues of that Congressional Budget Office report of June of 22.
Mayor Court, I'm not a diplomat. In fact, I'm known for being undiplomatic. And in that vein, I'll ask, how disruptive to our commercial diplomacy are sanctions or the threat of sanctions?
You already announced that you were as part of the sanctions office.
Exactly. I think if we take this at a global level, I don't know that they're that terrifically disruptive to most of the business that most companies do. In working on sanctions, I think we tended to during my time, we were focusing on Iran, North Korea. Those were really and actually at that point too, because there's been a change in government in Myanmar, Burma, we were actually looking at trying to take sanctions off. And one of the things we found is if you think it's fun putting sanctions on, taking them off can be even more complicated. Burma, unfortunately, went back to the wrong way, so I'm sure my successors have put everything we took off, put back on. South Africa might be a good example of one that took things off. But there are still provisions out there. I mean, Jackson Vanik lives, and has an impact on our trade with Central Asia still. Now the Soviet Union's gone. Central Asian countries have their human rights issues, but it's not what was going on against Jews in the Soviet Union. But yet that provision is still on the books and still has an impact on our trade policies towards that part of the world. So that's one aspect. I would, there are certain things, I think this is where the national security piece does come in big time. In tech industries, and when you get to certain levels, and when you suddenly start crossing various levels of things, they can become a problem. I wouldn't say necessarily in terms of sanctions, but in terms of licensing, export licensing, and so forth. And different administrations have taken different approaches on that. I've been whipsawed personally as different groups came in and went out. You probably have as well. Commerce gets this big time. But I think in terms of the general macro picture of the billions, trillions of dollars of U.S. trade, I don't know the sanctions necessarily come in and affect that much, but they will affect things in particular markets. They will affect things in particular sectors. And I think the companies that are active in those sectors, that's where the CEO knows big time what it is that's going on in this. I mean, you may have a better...
They would pay a lot of attention to sanctions because you're blocked from a market. So you have to figure a way around it. Or you can get in trouble because your product was made somewhere and put in down the line. And
or resold.
Or resold, and that is a no-no. And so it's extremely complicated. And companies, frankly, governments have a lot of tracking mechanisms. Companies are reinventing the wheel every time they have to put into place a tracking mechanism. It's the same problem with taking state incentives or federal incentives or Ex-Im Bank financing or development bank, the Asia Development Bank or the European Development Bank, which has a more complicated name, I've forgotten it exactly. But every time you take one of those interactions with government, companies have to track it, they have to track all their exports, and it's extremely complicated, and they're not really set up for that. They really don't have an apparatus that is easily accessible to take care of all of those things. And so I think that overlay, that's the national security and the foreign policy and geopolitical overlay that gets companies to cringe at the idea of let's do more investment, let's try and use the government apparatus. They're nervous about it, and they are nervous about sanctions, but it really is a strategic, small portion usually of what someone's business is. It's not whole cloth. It's not a whole sector. It's not a whole country, except for maybe Russia.
Russia's I think, the thing.
A far extreme example. But it does make it more complicated for companies, and they have to think about that. But that's the same level of sophistication that they don't always have with the foreign policy sort of aspect.
There's a question online, which unfortunately I can't really read with the reflection.
Somebody read it for us.
Can someone read it for us?
Are there any estimates by commerce, state, or business groups of what portion of U.S. firms with export potential are aware of, favorably disposed toward, and have actually used export support from commerce, state, USDA, etc., from Todd Thurwasher, U.S. China Foundation for Exchange and Development?
Yeah, you keep statistics every year of how many, Commerce and State do report every year of how many commercial transactions the U.S. government supports.
So the export pool of companies that actually export more than like accidentally, but export on as a part of their business plans is somewhere between 250,000 to 300,000 companies in the U.S. And we're all these small companies in particular, small, medium sized. That's a pool that could be growing. It's something we need to work on. But of a proportion of that pool, for example, I mentioned earlier that we last year met with and helped 51,000 distinct exporters in that process. So that's there's much more to do. And then when you talk about resources, you think about, well, you want to reach out and grab companies and bring them to markets overseas. You want to reach out and tell a company, hey, look, it's not just about your neighborhood or your state or your region. It's about the world today. And if you see a company, and our U.S. field offices, see a lot of these companies. If they see a company that really has an opportunity to export because they've got a great product, they're cutting edge, whatever the case might be, that company may not be ready. And a lot of the challenges that big companies have in terms of doing business overseas, it's magnified tenfold for a small firm. And that's where we can really be helpful. But finding those companies and adding to that pool is really important. So government resources, the more we can do, the more resources we have, the more we can build that 51,000 into a third of the companies, get it up to 100,000 or something like that. Technology is helpful. Often today, as we know, to reach out to small, medium-sized firms and innovative firms, they're doing it on the web. They're looking for things on the web, and I think that's something we're trying to tap into as well. But it's about 250,000 to 300,000 active exporters, and we're getting, 50,000 of that right now, and we'd love to see that double. We had a commitment under this administration, under Secretary Raimondo, to double the number of clients that we served from about 35,000 up to about 70,000. We're on track to hit that possibly this year, so we're excited about that, but that's with, existing resources, and so, yeah.
We have two questions, and I think we have time for maybe we'll have them asked consecutively, and then we can answer together as a panel.
Sure. Okay. Howdy. My name's Stephen Wyrick, and I'm a policy analyst with the U.S. Export-Import Bank. And so since we were brought up, I thought I'd come up and ask a follow-up question. Specifically, when you mentioned the satellite deal, I was just kind of curious, in your experiences, how often have y'all found that U.S. companies were missing out on opportunities with foreign buyers because they weren't able to access export financing?
Great. And Sean?
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Kathleen. Just on the sanctions point that was made, it's more of a point than a question. I think the key is whether the sanctions that are envisioned, are they unilateral or are they multilateral? If they're multilateral, if you get all the major suppliers to join you in doing them, then obviously the adverse impact on U.S. business is less. And my sense is we've really made progress in that area. 20, 30 years ago, the instinct in administrations and Congress to do sanctions unilaterally, like, oh, something bad has gone on in Zaire, we're going to put sanctions on them. People have learned, painfully perhaps, that try to get them multilateral, and for many reasons to do that, but one of them is on the commercial side. Thanks.
So on Exim, and I'll turn it over, I can honestly say, as an economic officer, I never really understood what our financing capabilities were. And I think it was one a real gap in my own knowledge as a person who did economic work for 25 years. And if I don't know, and then I'm assuming businesses don't know, but I would turn it over to Bob. You've had the example.
Yeah, I think, and actually I'm going to come at this a little bit differently, and this is really sort of work I was doing subsequently to being in the department. One of the problems, or undiplomatic problem, realities, opportunities, is that for policy reasons, my understanding, Exim and DFC will do things in certain markets and up to certain levels. So once you graduate to, you move from emerging market or middle economy to high income country, and the countries like Romania, which are like, go back and forth on this. This year they have enough money, next year they may not. Is that, okay, can the company use DFC? Can they use Exim financing? There's also various sorts of windows that are sort of being set up at different times. There are things which are sort of being precluded at different times, and I think right now the whole question of financing for hydrocarbon exports and how this fits in with climate change is something that's a factor. There are cleaner hydrocarbon technologies that might be good for the environment in certain countries, which are being precluded. So this kind of thing, I think, becomes difficult, and I think this becomes sort of, I've sat down actually with offices. TDA, US TDA is sort of in this, Trade Development Agency, is another one that gets caught in this, where some of our policies in different areas sort of come through and have an impact on what it is a US company can do and how they can sort of find the financing, which European governments might not feel quite so constrained about doing, and God knows what China will feel about doing, or Korea, or Japan.
I think it goes back to the narrative that we're all trying. I think we're not trying to create a narrative. The narrative already exists. What we have in our tools, we're just not doing a good job of explaining it, showcasing it, leveraging it, introducing it to new actors, new players. And I think, again, as we are trying to not revitalize, I agree with commercial diplomacy is here, we're doing more, the momentum is behind us, but we got to move it faster, quicker, more urgently, more comprehensively, because the world is changing so quickly, and I think part of it is figuring out how to tell the story more effectively. I know we're just about out of time. I'm going to give everyone a final word. If you want to say, if we were back here in 5 years, what would we be saying about what a great success our commercial diplomacy is?
We will have had the President of the United States lead 4 or 5 commercial trade shows and other events in partnership with other diplomatic priorities, as the French president is doing now, and the Chinese president did a few weeks ago, and other presidents of other countries do. So that would be a success I would hope to see. And I would like to see more ambassadors. We haven't talked too much today about how some ambassadors do a great job of bringing those 22 agencies that you talked about at your one post together. Some ambassadors see their job as a leadership, and other ambassadors give up on the challenge of trying to bring the 22 agencies together in a cohesive. So I would hope to see 5 years from now more ambassadors with good leadership skills that bring their whole team together on commercial advocacy in a better basis. Those are the 2 things I would hope.
Kathleen?
I would like to see and hope that we would see the business community put the pull aspect together, pull the administration along and demand that, as opposed to being, sort of pulled in every now and then on a schedule. Could you please go with the president to something or other on Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock? And they can't possibly organize that. They're already booked. So the business community could organize themselves to pull the administration along, and so therefore the administration steps up to the plate, any administration, and makes it a higher priority. And to make that happen, I would say we need Dale as head of the Foreign Commercial Service with all the resources that he needs.
Bob?
I'm going to come at this with 2 things. One is one that I came in here with, and that is hoping to see the private sector do more in helping educate the government, not just in terms of what's going on today, but what's coming next. And I think 5G was a good example when we all went scrambling and trying to barely figure out our cell phones to let alone what was coming. But what's coming next? We need to know that, and not just the top, but the whole way through our diplomatic service, and that includes commerce and agriculture. The second thing is what's come out of, I think, the meeting today, and that is strong engagement with state and local governments in terms of what their companies are looking to do, sort of getting down to that level, working. State Department goes everywhere, Commerce Department goes in the U.S., we don't go in the U.S. So working together on that front to get a better sense of what can be done and energizing that and building on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say when you look at the support for U.S. business that we have in the U.S. government, it's kind of fractionalized. It's in different bureaus, it's in different departments, it's in different agencies, and companies have to shop around and find things that are going to be supportive to them, which is often the reason that they're late to the game in terms of getting deals. What I would like to see 5 years from now is something we've been battling with since I joined Commerce in 1985, and that is this kind of best kept, that the U.S. government's support for U.S. business is kind of a best kept secret. Companies want to compete with each other, so they sometimes don't tell each other that the U.S. government or the state and local governments can help you. That best kept secret, I think, is not just for the Foreign Commercial Service, but it's for government in general in support of our companies. I'd like to turn that around in 5 years and see what we're seeing with China and France and the UK and others. That, hey, look at what the Chinese government is doing for its companies. Look at what the French are doing for their companies. I would like to see, look at what America's doing for its companies. That narrative, that flip in the narrative means that we finally got it right.
Well, I want to thank each of the panelists for a great discussion, and I'm going to turn it over to Bill for final remarks. But Bill and Sean, thank you.
Well, thank you to the panel. We have one more event, cognizant that I'm keeping you from lunch, but lunch is not quite ready, so we have a little bit of time. So we're going to excuse this panel, and Sean Donnelly and I are going to do a brief wrap-up, and then we'll invite you all to stay with us for lunch. Thank you. Welcome back. That was quick. I'm here with Sean Donnelly, our ambassador to Sri Lanka, as I recall.
Back in the day, yes.
Back in the day. But more important, he and the Academy produced two significant reports on exactly this subject in 2014 and 2016. So now, with the benefit now of 9 years in one case and a few other years, let's start out, Sean, by maybe you can comment first on what did we learn today, and how are things different now than they were back when you wrote that report? Or are your recommendations then still relevant?
Well, I think at the highest level, not a lot has changed. I think the recommendations, which we made in the two reports, Chuck Ford, a former Director General of the FCS, ambassador in Honduras, was my partner in this Academy effort. And we did the first report in 2015, 2016, and had significant engagement from the Obama administration, second term, and they came back, Commerce and State worked with us and asked us to dig down a little deeper in 2 or 3 areas on training, on relations between the administration and the business community, and that kind of led to the second report shortly thereafter. And then, as other people have said, we sort of hit the Trump administration and, frankly, now the Biden administration, and have not had much luck getting senior people in the administration very engaged with us on it. So I'm not sure a lot has changed. I think the recommendations, these are the two reports. And if you picked up the summary of the reports, it has the link to the Academy website where there are copies available, electronic copies. I think they're still worth reading, but I'm a little biased there. But I think what we heard today is what's the priority the administration's going to do on this? What are the resources they're willing to put behind it? Where do commercial issues fit vis-a-vis other issues, human rights and other things that you're promoting? So I think we're in not a very dissimilar place.
I want to come back to the human rights issue in a minute, but first, what do we need, besides more money and more people, right, which is a common theme, what else needs to happen?
Well, I think it needs to be a much higher national priority. Chuck Cobb says it clearly. We need the White House involvement in it. I think it does have to be a whole of government. You need the Defense Department working with the defense contractors and so on. You need the Department of Agriculture, Treasury Department, including at the World Bank and so on, really making this a higher priority. And frankly, my experience, 38 years in working in the U.S. government, if you don't have White House involvement, direct involvement of the president and the vice president in some way, it's going to get very hard to maintain the interest and the support. So I do think the issue that Chuck raises very graphically of having White House involvement in it and working, and not just a one-time thing. It's got to be a sustained effort, a regular dialogue with business about what are the challenges, what are their priorities, how can we take that forward?
Is it also important for the secretaries of those agencies to set the tone? I mean, when you were ambassador, did it matter what messages you were getting from the secretary about what your priorities ought to be?
Well, yeah, every ambassador gets a letter from the president as you go out, and here are your priorities, and it's, I think, what, a 3 or 4 page letter the last time I saw it, and commercial issues were somewhere on page 2, along with all the other things about values and security of citizens that are equally important. I think we have to be realistic. Nobody's going to stop caring about anything else, and we just totally do commercial diplomacy, commercial advocacy. So yeah, it's got to fit into an overall context. I think we had a clear sense from the government. I was an ambassador late in the Clinton administration. This isn't a partisan issue, but some administrations are better at it in articulating it than others. You talked about Ron Brown. He kind of, not obviously especially at Commerce, but I think that spirit carried out into other agencies. The other thing I would just say, Chuck talked about the ambassadors that have won the Cobb Award. These are not necessarily economic career people who've done that. It's the Tom Pickerings and Bill Burns and Nick Burns of the world. These are some of our best ambassadors, and they have the overall skills. It's not that different being a salesman for policy than being a salesman for American companies or for an American commercial interest like standards or IPR. Or getting bids evaluated on a total life cycle of a project cost. So these are really important things. And if ambassadors get involved in it, if they really are the chief commercial officer, if they're leading the commercial team out there in those embassies, it really makes a difference.
One of the issues that came up from time to time, which maybe we can go into a little bit more depth on, was financing.
Yes.
And the use of the Export-Import Bank in particular. How important is coordination with the bank, which is kind of a quasi-independent agency? And how did that work when you were in this business? Were you able to coordinate with the bank? Did they reach out, or were they sort of off here by themselves doing their own thing?
Well, I had 6 overseas posts as an economic officer, a deputy ambassador, or an ambassador. And only one of them had an FCS, Foreign Commercial Service officer there. So I was mainly in poorer, smaller markets, developing countries. But Exim Bank was a major player. Now, early in my career, I'd been the State Department working level guy who went to the Exim board meetings every week. So I happened to personally know more about how the bank worked and who the people were and so on like that. But I thought, this is back in the day, but I thought Exim Bank did a pretty good job of staying in contact. I mean, my sense is that back then, and I believe it's still true today, even with the enhancements at Exim, we provide official government support for a smaller percentage of our exports than almost any of our competitors. There are a lot of reasons for that. We have a deeper private capital market and so on. But I do think financing, whether it's Exim Bank, the new Development Finance Corporation, the Trade and Development Agency on those feasibility studies, are really key. And if we're going to get serious about commercial diplomacy, those programs need to be strengthened, enhanced, learn what works, and so on. Because financing really does matter. Some of the growing markets are developing countries, and so they may have trouble going to the private market. So I do think it's critical.
I think Kathy Novelli in the first panel alluded to the difference in the potential cost difference. And one of the issues that I think has been complicated for and you can tell me I'm wrong, for our commercial diplomacy people is to make the case convincingly that quality and long-term costs matter, in some respects, more important than short-term price.
Right.
Is that a selling point? Can we can we convince other countries that our products are it's not just a question of products being better in the short run, that maybe ours will last longer and that the life cycle cost
that's this whole
is
issue of
lower.
total project life cycle cost, and I think that's a policy issue like IPR and standards and genetically modified products, where it's not project advocacy, but it's policy advocacy, and senior officials in Washington and the embassies really need to be pushing that, because we're very, very rarely going to be the low-cost supplier, particularly as we compete more with China and Korea and India in more and more markets. We're not where we were 30, 40 years ago, where you said made in America and everybody kind of instinctively said, well, that must be the best quality. I think we have to keep pushing the quality of our products. We have to try to be price competitive where we can. And we have to keep making the case, particularly on infrastructure type projects, that it's not just the initial sticker price, it's the cost over a 25 or 30 year life cycle.
You mentioned one of the magic words, and Matt Goodman alluded to this in his panel too, which is China. And he said you can't have a conversation these days without talking about that. So, but let's put this in the context of what both panels really discussed, particularly the second one, which is sort of the national security policy context. And one of the things that Kathleen Ambrose said is that, you know, we are not encouraging exports to or investment in China right now. And that's a national security issue, I think, is the question. So I guess the questions are, one, is that right? And two, if it is right, is that really the policy we should be pursuing? Should commercial diplomacy be explicitly an instrument of U.S. national security policy?
Well, I think we have to recognize that it is, whether it should be or it isn't. I think we are naive if we think that somehow all U.S. policy decisions should be based on commercial interest alone, and we don't pay any attention to human rights or environmental impact or political relations with the countries or so on. That's going to be a factor. The White House is always going to have views about which countries are key or which are supporting us on Middle East peace, and that those are going to impinge on pure economic decisions. I think what it comes down to is the issue we've been talking about here today. How high a priority is commercial diplomacy and our commercial competitiveness and interest? Because it is going to, every day, come up against issues where other policy interests are going to be intersecting. And I think many of us feel that over the long term, there's been a general sense that the commercial advocacy, commercial interest, commercial diplomacy hasn't been as high as it should have been. But it's always going to be viewed by presidents and cabinet members and ambassadors against a backdrop of other things. And so we're not going to be selling nuclear power plants to Burma or something just because it's a commercial interest. There's going to be a weighing. I think the key is commercial advocacy, commercial interest, are they going to have an appropriate weighting? And many of us feel, and I think what we've heard a lot of people here hint at today, is that it isn't as high, it hasn't had as much priority, as much resources as it deserves.
I guess the prioritization, from what you're saying, I think operates in kind of two ways, in the sense that one of the things the government can do is set priorities. This is important, this sector is important, critical minerals, for example, is important. You can also set sort of negative priorities. Don't go there. You know, don't try to market the nuclear plant in Burma, because that's not a place where we want to get right. Let me talk to us for a minute about the first one, the critical minerals, and not just about minerals, and that's sort of an economic priority, but what we're seeing, particularly in this administration, I think, is the addition of other priorities to commercial relationships, human rights, sustainability, the environment, labor. I think, as Chuck said, this gets into overall trade policy. But that's all right. We can get into overall trade policy. That's what we here at CSIS and the Schul Chair do. Does this get in the way of, do these things get in the way of commercial diplomacy, or are they important additions?
I think they're part of the overall mosaic of that you have to be aware of, and they're going to be competitions, and they don't all neatly line up and say this, and this, and this. We're going to have make tough calls about is this a project that we want to go all out on and have the president, call the president or prime minister of the other country, or are there other factors? I mean, policy making at the highest level is even more complicated than policy making we have done at our levels over the years. I think, but it's going to be there. I think it just keeps coming back to getting all the key players, the Congress, the administration at the cabinet level, and the White House, committed that this is an important priority, one of the top priorities, whatever. And then you got to kind of get in there and, I don't know, battle is the right thing, but work to make the best decisions you can.
Just out of curiosity, how often does the president actually call his counterpart in another country on a commercial deal?
Well, people like Tony would have a sense. It has happened. I'm aware of some cases. Each president's a little different. Some liked doing it, some resisted it. But it does happen. It ought to happen more, in my view, because if you don't think that Macron or the British prime minister or the Japanese prime minister are calling or taking groups of businessmen, you don't know what's been going on. We're not, our level of activity in the commercial diplomacy area has not kept up with what many of our competitors are doing in calls, in visits, in taking businessmen along on important meetings.
Well, let's then, we're running low on time. Let me just say, if anybody has a question for us, the microphone's over there. But let me talk, one of the issues that we've talked about several times is CABDA.
Yes.
And the legislation. What's your view on implementation? Is that coming along? Is it achieving any
I agree with Ron Newman, my friend. I replaced Ron 40-some years ago as commercial officer in Senegal as I went off of my first post. And he was smart then and he's smart now. I think he captured the sense that people are, and I appreciate the Undersecretary and Dale and the efforts, and I know this is hard, but it's been 3 years, and I think people are looking for a little bit more. What was encouraging, at least to me, out of CABDA, is that you got, what were there, 3 or 4 negative votes in the House. I think it was almost unanimous in both houses, a bipartisan commitment that this is an important priority and the administration ought to be doing more. And I just hate to see that momentum from Capitol Hill get lost because the administration's been slow to pick up on it. And I'm encouraged by Dale's comments that efforts are underway, and that's great. I don't think the moment's been lost. I just think it's critical that something happening because we're going to be into an election and then on to a new administration or a second administration. So yeah, I think the mood of the room on CABDA and what I sense to be the mood of the business community in general, that we're a little disappointed that there isn't more real concrete progress is accurate. It's one I share.
Okay, we have an audience question. Sir, please identify yourself.
My name is Yaya Fanusi. I'm with the United States of Africa 2017 project. I don't usually have a question for the groups. I usually tell them what's about to happen. 2025, the 54 countries in Africa will declare Songhai Federation, United States of Africa. You should be concerned in getting in right now, involving infrastructure. Otherwise, the countries that are involved in infrastructure development in Africa, they are the ones who are going to get all the commercial activities. I could tell you that. I know. I'm the one who replaced Gaddafi in this project.
Well, I don't know a lot about the detailed prospects for 2025. What I do know is Africa is a huge opportunity out there, particularly on infrastructure, and some of our competitors, led by China, are much more active than we are out there and offering subsidized finance. Now, I was an ambassador in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka is the poster child for what happens when you get too engaged with with the Chinese and on their commercial loans and so on like that. So I would urge some of our African friends to proceed a little carefully as they jump into this. But if we're not offering them from the U.S. side, business and government, any real options, governments are going to want to do something, and they may make some bad decisions.
Yes, I just noticed reading this morning, one of the issues that is on the table this week in another building about, less than a mile from here in the World Bank IMF buildings is debt relief, and debt relief for developing countries, and is primarily Chinese debt.
Yes.
And the Chinese have not yet indicated a willingness to forgive some of that debt, and that's
So
the
they
issue
now
that's on the
own
table.
the port
We'll
system
see.
in Sri Lanka.
That's
Yes.
an example.
Yes.
And I think a good example of why commercial diplomacy on fair and equitable terms is important. I think that's about it. I don't see other questions. I don't see questions on the screen, so.
I see food out there.
Yeah. I thank the audience for its attention. I thank the online audience for its attention. For those of you that are here, please, this is a buffet-style lunch. The food is in the atrium. Please go out and get it. Feel free to come back here to a table and continue the conversation. Thank you very much.